3 years ago, I was looking at the local job classifieds online when one of the ads caught my eye, not because of what it said, but because it said so little. Best I remember, the ad just read job available, good pay, no benefits, discretion required. It then listed an email address, and that was all. At the time, I was managing a music store, but I'd already started hearing rumors we would be shutting down within the next year, and the likelihood of a transfer to another store was slim. I had been morosely looking at job listings for the last few days, but this was the first one that stood out, if only because I was bored and it was weird, so I sent an email. Half an hour later, I had a response telling me to go to a particular office building in an upscale part of the city at a precise time from my screening. I went, and after waiting for a few minutes in the lobby, I was taken into an office where I was given a series of forms and questionnaires to fill out. They collected them and told me they would be in touch. I had almost forgotten about the whole thing until a month later. I got a call saying I had moved on to the second stage of the hiring process. I was again given an address and time. And when I arrived this time, it was a different, nice office park, 20 miles away from the first one. I was met by a man who introduced himself as Mr. Solomon. He escorted me into a large room that contained a chair and a desk. On the desk were two large monitors, a keyboard and mouse, and a bolted-down metal box with two oversized buttons on it, one red and one green. He told me this room was a model for the place I would be working if I took the job. He described the job as follows. I would be working 7 shifts of 6 hours every week. My job would be simple. I would arrive at work 10 minutes early and enter an outer area that was like a locker room. I would have my own personal locker. I would store all belongings in the locker and change into the provided work clothes. I was never under any circumstances to carry any item of my own into the surveillance room. I was never under any circumstances to take any item with me from the surveillance room. As for what I was to do in the surveillance surveillance, I was told that the monitor on the left would constantly show a live stream from a high-definition camera in a remote location. My job was simply to watch the camera. After an hour, I would get onto the computer attached to the right monitor and enter a brief log describing anything interesting that occurred in the last hour. I would have no pens or pencils or paper, and I should never try to take any kind of written notes about the work. As for the red and green buttons, the red button was only to be used if there was an emergency. This meant something on the video or in my workspace that required outside help. The green button was to be hit if I saw something on the video feed that was particularly noteworthy. It would tell other people somewhere that, at least in my opinion, something interesting was going on. Solomon stressed that while I was given discretion on when to use this button, I should err on the side of only using it if and when something of real significance occurred. He pointed out the camera on the ceiling of the room we were in. He said the real room would be the same. My work would be observed, and other people were watching the room on the video feed as well. He said I was only a redundancy in case other systems failed. He then smirked and asked if I knew what he meant by redundancy. I nodded, trying not to show my irritation. I don't talk that good to people, so sometimes they think I'm dumb. That's okay. Let him think that if he paid me good enough. The pay was very good, $35 an hour. This worried me. I was already thinking this was some kind of psych experiment or secret government job, which I was okay with. But that kind of money to sit and watch a screen. My mom always told me that if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. And this was seeming too good to be true. I asked if I was going to be doing anything illegal. Solomon laughed and said no. I asked if anyone was going to get hurt. Again, he shook his head no. He said the reason they were paying so much was because they needed employees that were motivated to be professional and discreet. What we were doing was important, and for various reasons it couldn't be discussed. If I took the job, I would have to sign papers promising I would never discuss my work there, or I could be sued or locked up. I'm only breaking that now because of everything that's happened. So I took the job, and because they wanted me to start right away, I had to quit the store with no notice. I felt bad about that, but I was excited of the new job too. It was a lot of money and seemed like easy enough work, if a bit boring. I was nervous that there was something more to it, but I told myself I would just have to see. No point in chickening out and wasting a good chance because I let my imagination go crazy. I was given the location of the job itself, and when I went there, I was amazed that it really was just like the model room. I had been shown with only a few differences. There was a locker room you had to pass through to enter the surveillance room, and there was a small bathroom attached to the real surveillance room also. The real room had a small water cooler in the corner, but because I wasn't allowed to bring anything in with me, I had to eat before or after every shift. The biggest difference, of course, was that the monitors were turned on. The right monitor was just a black and white terminal like you see in movies sometimes. I could type in my logs, but no internet to look at or anything like that. The left monitor was video from a room. You would call it a bedroom, I guess, because it had a bed in it. But it had lots of other stuff too. A TV, a sofa and chairs, a couple of tables, and plenty of empty space in between. The camera must be high up in a corner because I could see pretty much everything except for the far sides of furniture. At first, though, I didn't notice any of that stuff, or all I saw was her, foot being blunt. She looked to be a little older than me and was very pretty. When I first saw her, she was laying on her side on the sofa. That was the part of the room farthest from the camera. But the picture was very clear and I could tell that she was sleeping. I found myself leaning into the monitor more so I could see her better. And then I thought about what I was doing and felt embarrassed. It's like I was spying on her. A peeping Tom, my mom used to call it. I didn't want to be a peeping Tom, but I didn't want to be silly either. I needed to think about it slow. It was a good job. And I wasn't doing anything wrong, right? I wasn't hurting anybody. The woman looked fine. And the room was nice. She probably agreed to be there and it's all some experiment or something. I was just overreacting. So I sat down in the chair and began my work. He had said, it didn't take long before I understood more. The woman I took to calling her Rachel wasn't there of her free will. I never saw her hurt, but it was clear that she never left that room except to go into what I think is a bathroom area that my camera couldn't see. Well, she never left the room on her own. Periodically, usually a couple of times a week during my shifts, men and women in strange-looking outfits would come in and take her from the room. Sometimes she would struggle, but usually she would just go along with her head hung low. They would always bring her back, though the times when she wasn't brought back during my shift were always the worst for me. I would worry about her until I got to work the next day and saw her in the room watching TV or painting. She never looked hurt or even that upset except for when they took her. And even when she fought, they were always gentle with her. Still, I knew something was wrong. I considered quitting the job or hitting the red button and getting someone to come so I could get some answers, or calling the police and showing them what the camera was showing me. Except I was scared. Scared of losing my job and scared of what these people might do to me if I quit or told on them. Solomon had told me when I took the job that part of being discreet was not asking questions. I would never be asked to do more than I had already been told. But I could never tell anyone what I did or saw, and I could never ask questions about what I was doing or why. So I made excuses. It was all an experiment. She was crazy or sick, and they were trying to help her. She was doing a job just like I was. Or if she really was a prisoner somewhere, at least I was watching to make sure that she was okay. If they ever tried to hurt her, or I saw that she really didn't want to be there for sure, I could get help then. In a way, I told myself, I was helping to protect her by watching. Don't expect you to think much of my excuses. I don't think much of them myself, especially now. But in my defense, when things changed, I didn't ignore it or try to explain it away. I knew something had to be done. Rachel would usually paint for an hour or two every day, and it seemed to always be during my afternoon shifts. The room had no windows as far as I could tell, but I guess she either used a clock or her own body's time to keep to a kind of schedule. I always liked to watch her paint. The thing she was painting was always facing the wrong way for me to see it, but I could see her face as she worked. She always looked peaceful and happy when she was painting. And seeing her that way, smiling serenely from time to time as she got something the way she wanted it, always made my day. First noticed something was wrong. When she started painting more frequently a few weeks ago, her expression was more focused and serious, and there was a tension to her movements that I wasn't used to seeing. At first, I thought she was just really trying to work hard on something, and I wanted to tell her not to worry. Every few weeks, the others would come in and take the old paintings out anyway, bringing in a new stack of. I think the word is canvas. Body were to sounds, and it was more than her being focused. Something was wrong. She didn't look happy, and she was going for hours at a time. In the span of 3 days, she had finished 4 paintings. I'd been growing more and more worried watching her work, and when she finished the 4th, I found myself telling her to just stop and rest a while. I'd grown accustomed to talking to the monitor, talking to her in my own way. First, but we promised that thought she didn't stop. Instead, she began moving the paintings, arranging them on the back and seat of a long sofa at the far end of the room. This was the first time I had gotten to see any of the paintings. Even when the others were taking them out, they always seemed to be turned away from the camera. I was still worried about her, but I was also happy to finally see something she had worked on. Happy and amazed. They were beautiful. One was a beautiful green forest. Another was an old stone well. A third was a house sitting alone on a small island. The last was an old-fashioned looking movie theater. All of them looked like something out of a dream, with trailing lines of color mixing in the air around them, like leaves caught in a wind. It was only when I looked close that I realized the lines of color weren't random. They were words, easy to miss if you weren't looking close. And by themselves, they didn't seem to mean much. Just the ghost of a word somewhere in each of the paintings, easy to lose in everything else that was being shown. I leaned into the monitor and squinted, trying to read the words. Then my heart started thudding as I made them out. Blinking and rubbing my eyes, I looked again, reading them out loud in order left to right, top pair, then bottom. Lee, Q-S-M. Q, Thomas. Rick. I pushed back from the monitor, my hand over my mouth. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how any of this could be happening. It wasn't just that she was asking for help, though that was a big part of it, was that my name is Thomas. I thought about the camera above me and took my hand away from my face. I rolled back to the desk and sat there, trying to stop from shaking, trying to make myself take a breath. Think about it slow. The first thing was, should I hit a button? The red button was for an emergency. If she was a prisoner or something and she was trying to escape, they might think that was an emergency. But no one had been hurt that I knew of, and I think Mr. Solomon meant save that for something that was like a police or ambulance emergency, not something like this. But what about the green button? This was definitely something noteworthy. Not only that she was asking for help, but that she was asking me for help made myself stop for a moment. I couldn't know for sure she was asking me. I had gone to school with several boys named Thomas. It was a common name. But the chances of her painting that name when I was working here, I didn't want to be silly. But I wasn't trying to be too opaque. What's that word? Mom used to say it when she read her angel books, skeptics. I didn't want to be a skeptic either. I had to believe it was probably meant for me. And that was something they would want to know. Should I hit the green button? My hands were drifting toward the metal box on the desk, but I hesitated. I didn't like breaking rules. And I was scared of what would happen if I broke these. If they really were holding her prisoner, then they were probably very bad people. But I didn't know that. Maybe they were good and she was bad, but I looked back at the monitor for the first time since reading the words. Rachel was already moving the paintings back off the sofa, as though she knew the message had been received. With a canvas in each hand, she glanced up at the camera as she moved across the room, and it felt like she was looking right at me. My chest tightened as my hands moved away from the buttons. No, I didn't think she was bad. I had watched her for years. I felt like I knew her would know if she was bad. Strange as it seemed, in a way she was my friend, and was going to try and help her. I spent the rest of my shift trying to act normal and think of what to do. I knew whoever else was watching might have noticed the paintings or seen how I acted, but I couldn't worry about that. I would try to play it cool and try to think how I could help her. The only people I had actually met connected to this job were a couple of people when I filled out the papers, and then Mr. Solomon when he showed me the model room and told me the job. I had no way of contacting any of them except through the buttons. My checks were deposited electronically, and I had never run into anyone else who worked at the surveillance room. The thought made me stop a second. I had always thought it was weird that I never ran into someone when I was coming or going, the person I was taking over for, or the person who was taking over for. I had always figured there must be other people, other surveillance rooms even, and they just scheduled us so we didn't run into each other. And I still thought there were others. Part of why I thought that was because it seemed like I wasn't the only person who used my surveillance room. The water cooler, the toilet paper, the soap, they all seemed to go down faster than I think I was using it by myself. If that was true, maybe I could figure out who they were. And maybe they would be safer to talk to than whoever it was that I worked for. I got off work at 8 that night, and instead of grabbing some food and going home, I drove my car around the block and then parked down the street from the building where I worked. Nothing had changed while I drove around for a minute. No new cars had parked or anything. And if I was right, they didn't send anyone to replace me until they were sure I was gone anyhow. So I sat and waited. I was tired and the street was pretty empty and boring. But I was too excited and scared to fall asleep. Every time a car passed or someone walked down the sidewalk, I tensed. I kept imagining a Soviet van pulling up behind me, men getting out and pulling me from my car, taking me somewhere like where they had Rachel to kill or torture me. Half a dozen times I almost cranked up and drove away, but every time I would think of her alone in that room. She had no one but me to help her. And I had to try. 2 hours later, a fat balding man parked and started heading for the building. As soon as I saw he was able to unlock the door and enter, I opened my car door to go talk to him. Then I stopped. I needed to be smart. I didn't know where they were, but I was sure there were hidden cameras in the locker room and outside the building. If I go running in there and confront that guy, they'll know for sure that I'm up to something. Lining with frustration, I shut the door back and waited until his shift was over. I considered tailing him like in the movies, but I was scared I would just lose him or he would call someone for help. So I waited. So he was walking back to his car after a 6-hour shift, hopefully far enough away that the cameras wouldn't see. And then I met the man I came to know as Charles Jeffries. Hey, keeper mess head. Him, I talked to you for a minute. His back was to me, and he just waved his hand absently without looking up. Sorry, I don't have any money. Have a good. He froze as he glanced back at me while talking.
God.
No. You need to get out of here, kid. We aren't allowed to talk. I could tell he was scared, but I couldn't risk letting him go yet, not after all this. He stepped up and pushed the door back shut as he was trying to get into his car. So you know who I am. I try to not sound mean, but I could hear how mad I was in my voice. He yanked at the door again, but I was still holding it. And I was stronger than he was. After a second, weaker tug, he turned around, his face strained and tired looking. Yeah, I know who you are. You work here just like me. And I'm telling you, we aren't supposed to be talking. We aren't supposed to meet ever. I frowned. Mr. Solomon never told me that. He never said it was one of the rules. The man shook his head. Mr. Solomon. Yeah, well, there are plenty of rules they don't tell you. I bet they didn't tell you what you were going to be watching before you started, did they? When I just lowered my eyes, he went on. Yeah, me either. I've been at this job for 10 years. I've seen other people come and go, usually because they broke one of those rules they never mentioned. The only reason I'm still here is because I keep my head down and my mouth shut. He wagged a finger at me. Worker saw it at me. You should do the same if it's not already too late. Felt my stomach curling into a cold knot. Too late? The man rubbed his face. Kid, do you think they don't know we're talking? Do you think anything happens that they don't know about? He looked back toward the building, a look of sadness and fear in his eyes. Shell, for all I know, you've already killed us both. Shaking his head. He pushed me back and started opening the door. Either way, I'm done risking it. You need to stop asking questions and just do your job. It's a lot healthier. With that, he got into his car and shut the door. I didn't try to stop him this time, even though I had already been worried about what he was telling me. Hearing it confirmed was paralyzing. What exactly was my plan? He probably didn't know any more than I did. And even if he did, what could I do with anything he told me? I walked back to my car with a heavy heart. I was still afraid, but more than that, I was sad and ashamed. I wanted to help Rachel, but I wasn't sure how. I wasn't giving up, but as I drove back to my apartment, I couldn't think of what I should do next. This wasn't a movie. I wasn't a hero, and the only ideas I had left were to either go to the police, who might be controlled by whoever I worked for, or try to get proof of her being held prisoner myself. So I parked my car and walked into my apartment building. I made a decision. Unless I thought of something better overnight, I would do both ideas. Tomorrow, I would break the rule about carrying anything in. I'd use my phone to record a video of the surveillance room, of Rachel and how she was trapped somewhere, and of me telling everything else I knew. And I would email it to every newspaper, website, and internet channel I could think of. I'd then go to the police and give them a copy too, if I could make it that long without getting caught. Maybe if I did all that, even if they got me, someone would help Rachel reap that signage. I was filled with worry and dread at the idea of being hurt or killed. A part of me kept saying I should just do as I was told and hope that it all went away. But I couldn't live with myself if I did that. Even if I messed up, I felt like I had to try. I was so preoccupied that I didn't hear the person coming up behind me as I unlocked my apartment door. Toms? I turned around and felt my legs weaken as I stumbled back against my door. I had to be dreaming or crazy. I grabbed the doorknob for support as I looked at the woman in front of me. It couldn't be her, but somehow it was. Rachel, back in September of 2017. After a bitter breakup with my girlfriend of 3 years, I found myself searching for a new place to live. Little did I know this would lead me to an experience far more unsettling than the breakup itself. After ending a 3-year relationship with my girlfriend, our breakup was so bitter that I had to move out immediately. On October 1st, I found myself in a hotel living out of boxes. For 2 weeks, my routine was grueling. Work during the day and search for apartments at night. The places I found online were depressing. Initially, I avoided shared apartments because I didn't want to live with a stranger. But as my hotel bill crept towards 4 figures, I started dropping more filters from my search. The possibility of having a roommate began to look more appealing, especially if I could meet them first to assess if they were going to be a problem. Everyone I talked to on the phone seemed either sketchy, unreliable, or a combination of the two. Just when I was about to give up, I met Florian. Florian was seeking a roommate to help pay the rent on his 2-bedroom apartment in Bushwick. It's like when I clicked on the photos of his place, I was shocked. The apartment was really nice, kind of a rustic warehouse type of vibe. but all the fittings and furniture looked brand new. The best part was what Florian wrote in his Little About Me section. He'd written something like, "I work exclusively at night, so you have the apartment to yourself in the evenings, but I require complete silence during daylight hours." Just as I perceived, I had just started working from home, and complete silence in the day was exactly what I was looking for. I sent him a message, we spoke on the phone, and then I arranged to stop by the apartment to talk face to face. The place was even nicer in person, and in many ways, Florian seemed like the ideal roommate. He was a tall, skinny Estonian guy, very dry and reserved, and wore a dark turtleneck and glasses. He said he was a filmmaker and was undertaking a project that exclusively involved night shoots, hence why he'd be out of the apartment by sundown. He was a sober vegetarian, but didn't mind if I kept meat or alcohol in the apartment. In fact, he didn't seem to care what I did, as long as I didn't smoke or make any noise whatsoever during the daytime. After explaining my situation and why silence during the day was ideal, I decided to test out his sense of humor and ask if he was a vampire. He didn't laugh. He didn't even crack a smile. He just replied, "No, as I said, I'm a vegetarian." Thankfully, my attempt at humor didn't spoil my chances, and since I volunteered my share of 3 months of rent in advance, he offered me the room right there and then. The following Monday, I was moving my stuff into the apartment. I had to wait until after 0 p.m., but with the help of a very flexible moving company, I had everything moved in by 0. By the end of the next day, I was unpacked and settled in. Living with Florian was like living with a ghost. He kept his end of the staying silent deal by being a ninja whenever I was asleep. Sometimes I'd go to the gym or go grocery shopping around the time he left for work, and we'd go days at a time without seeing each other. I had a quiet place to work during the day and had someone who wouldn't infringe on his schedule or lifestyle while paying half the rent. It was ideal, really. But sometimes Florian was so quiet it was almost spooky. I'd wake up, head downstairs to make my coffee, and walk into a spotless kitchen. But then when I opened up the fridge, there'd be a week's worth of vegetarian meal. Prep all boxed up and ready to go when the previous night there had been nothing but a few beers and my leftover box of Hollow Cart Street meat. I know that might sound like a weird thing to complain about, but I'm not even really complaining about it. I guess what I'm trying to say is that was the closest thing to a red flag I ever got with Florian, and I kind of wish there had been more to go on. So for the first 7 to 8 weeks, I lived in a state of almost complete bliss. I'd somehow managed a clean break from my ex-girlfriend, so although it still bothered me somewhat, it wasn't like she was blowing up my phone, and she certainly didn't know where to find me. Having my brand new uber quiet, super juicy workspace with its minimalist decor and monochrome color scheme made it very easy to pour myself into my projects, find my peace, and just sort of move on. I found the perfect temporary living arrangement, or at least I thought I had. Today, I finished work at around 5:0, walked down the block to get some noodles from the good old Canton place. When I was walking back to the apartment, I felt my cell phone buzzing in my pocket. It was Florian, and when I answered the call, he asked me in his typically dry tone for a favor. The location that they had in mind for that night's shoot was, in his words, unavailable, and to avoid having to reschedule the entire shoot, Florian wanted to know if he could use the apartment. He was very apologetic, promised it to be a one-time only thing, but told me that I'd either have to vacate my apartment for the evening or remain in my bedroom for the duration of the shoot. I told him it was no problem, especially if it was just a one-time deal. Then told him that I'd meet him back at the apartment about an hour. Florian arrived with his 2 friends, one guy and one girl, and they had a bunch of what appeared to be equipment bags with them. The girl was small and attractive, and the guy was a little bit overweight and balding, despite being American. Both shared Florian's sort of art hipster vibe and were just as quiet and reserved as he was. Once they were ready to set up, I grabbed my laptop and stuff and then started walking up to my room. The apartment had a small second floor when Florian asked if we could talk in private. I invited him into my room and asked him what he wanted to talk about. For the first time since I'd known him, Florian had some semblance of emotion on his face. Florian looked unusually concerned as he explained how some might consider his project to be unusual. It required complete immersion on the part of the cast and crew, which was why, under no circumstance, was I to leave my bedroom during the shoot. It was around 8 p.m., and I was due to sleep at around 11:00, so I had no problem retiring to my room to play some CV, or just watch Netflix until I dozed off. Florian said that was good because the shoot was going on until about 1:00 in the morning. Obviously, I wasn't all that excited at the prospect of having my sleep disturbed, But that led Florian to ask if I had a good pair of earplugs or some headphones that I could use to drown out the noise. But then that got me thinking, what kind of noise was he talking about? I half-jokingly asked if he was making an adult movie down there, and in his typical dry fashion, he said no, that was not the kind of movie he was making. My curiosity was pretty truly piqued at this point. So I asked him what kind of noises I could expect to hear. In response, Florian told me something I'll never forget. He told me, you might hear some things that might frighten or disturb you, but I can assure you, no matter what you hear, it is merely a simulation and there's no reason for you to be alarmed. I asked Florian if he was making some kind of horror movie, and he said no, it wasn't a horror movie as such, but it did contain elements which some people might associate with horror films. Apparently, this was why it was so important that I wear headphones or earplugs. Otherwise, I might not be able to sleep. I told him as long as there wasn't any screaming, we'd be fine. And that's when Florian asked again if I wouldn't be happier just vacating the apartment until 1:00 a.m. Honestly, I was way too tired to head out to some bar and force myself to stay awake until 1, and since I had a good pair of noise-canceling headphones that I could use, I figured I'd just brave the noise, and at worst stay up until the small hours watching movies extra loud until the shoot finally finished. The plan worked perfectly for a while, and for the first hour or so, I didn't even have to switch on the noise-canceling setting on my headset. I actually had it switched to ambient aware because, by that point, I was honestly so curious as to what kind of noises Florian was worried about me hearing. I figured there'd be yelling, probably some screaming after Florian's soft admission. And I just severely underestimated the kind of screams I'd be hearing as well as the effect they'd have on me. I've been playing Civ 5 for about an hour and change before I started to hear the first noises coming from downstairs. It was the sound of a woman sobbing like these drawn out sounds, and since Florian had already told me that she was an actress, the sound only made me uncomfortable, not frightened or disturbed. I switched my headphones to noise canceling and turned up the background music on my game, and found the combination instantly drowned out the sobbing noises. I think that lasted for maybe 20 to 30 minutes, until eventually, I started to hear another kind of sound. One so loud it started to cut through the noise-canceling feature on my headphones. Reached up to the speaker covering my right ear, lifted it up, and then instantaneously recoiled when I heard the sound that I'd been shielded from. The girl downstairs, actress or not, was letting out the single most blood-curdling scream I've ever heard. I could hear the exact moment she ran out of breath as the scream kind of weakened and died, and then she started up again right after with yet another ear-splitting screech. She did this over and over, and at one point I clearly heard someone yelling louder at her, but I couldn't tell if it was Florian or his friend. I knew it wasn't for real. I knew it was just an act, but there was something about that lady's scream that set my teeth on edge. I could only sit there listening to it for a minute or two before I secured my headphones over my ears and just pumped up the volume on my laptop even further and tried my best to forget it was even happening. I tried my best to just focus on playing this game, but I could still hear those on a chalkboard style screams, and they might have been very faint, but I could still hear them if I focused my attention on them over the music coming from my headphones. The only way to completely drown them out by then was to boost up the volume of my headphones to like 100, but that got so loud that it started to actually hurt my ears, so it wasn't sustainable for more than a few minutes before I had to lower the volume again. Thankfully, the screams had petered out altogether by the time it came to lowering my headphone volume, and I got to spend the next few minutes in relative peace before I suddenly started to hear the sound of frantic begging creeping through the music in my ears. Since I lifted my headphones, and once again I heard some skin-crawlingly convincing acting from the lady downstairs. Only this time she wasn't screaming, she was begging through tears and shallow breaths. She kept saying no, please God, no, and other variations on that theme. And she did it nonstop for about 14 straight minutes. I guess talking loudly was easier on her vocal cords than balls-to-the-wall screaming. But that allowed her to do it unceasingly for way longer than she screamed for. Again, I was thankful that I was able to just drown it out without deafening myself with the music from the game that I was playing. But somehow all the begging got to me even worse than the screams did. I swear to God, even with Florian's warning that the whole thing was just acting, every fiber of my being wanted to make her stop. I guess it bothered me in this sort of deep lizard brain kind of way, something passed down from our ancestors that means when you hear someone begging for their life or screaming in agony, it's impossible to just sit there and ignore it. That's why even when I couldn't hear the girl begging and sobbing anymore, I could still sort of feel it, you know. The screams came and went for another few hours. Then around 10:30, I decided to take a shower and try to get some sleep. Both upstairs bedrooms were fitted with attached bathrooms, another perk of living there. So I got to drown out the noises with a podcast and running water while I got clean. But then, once I got out of the shower, there was a brief window where I had to get my hair dry before putting my headphones back on. And in that time, I heard the most disturbing thing yet. I was still listening to my podcast. And I picked probably the loudest person possible to listen to. Shout out to Tim Dillon. But as I was drying my hair, I started to hear what sounded like all three people chanting downstairs. I was kind of curious as to what they were chanting, so I walked over to my phone and lowered the volume on my podcast and heard, "Hail Satan, hail Satan, hail Satan," getting louder and louder. Well, they sure must have been talented actors because they were giving it everything they had, wailing those two words again and again like they were in total ecstasy. I ended up lying on my bed, headphones on, blasting myself with some YouTube playlist called Relaxing Ambient Music that ended up being neither relaxing nor ambient. When 0 a.m. rolled around and everything finally went quiet, I literally whispered, "Thank you, Jesus," out loud to myself before finally drifting off. Next morning, I felt kind of groggy after getting less than 6 hours of sleep. But as my brain booted up in the shower, I remembered all the screaming and chanting from the night before. I couldn't really be mad at Florian because he'd warned me a whole 2 times to vacate the apartment. And besides, there were much worse things than him owing me a favor. As I mentioned earlier, Florian and I rarely bumped into each other, so it was days before I got a chance to ask him about the screaming. And when I did, he gave me about as dry an answer as you can imagine. He apologized profusely for the disturbance, both literally and figuratively, but was also quick to remind me of the warning I'd been given. He said the screams and the chanting were what he called ADR, or automated dialogue replacement, which is basically when you dub audio over a movie to make it sound better. No one was being threatened, imitated, or hurt in any way. And the lady in question was just a very talented actress. If the sounds she made disturbed me, then it simply meant that she'd put in a good performance and nothing more. This was obviously quite reassuring, I guess. But my main objective was to get a second assurance that it wouldn't happen again. And if it absolutely had to, then to give me advance warning so I could book a hotel or something. He agreed, and I thanked him. And that was that. Not even 2 weeks went by before Florian asked me for a second favor. I had a feeling it'd be related to using the apartment for his work. And lo and behold, I was right. He opened his pitch by telling me that he was more than happy to pay for a night in a hotel, but that after his studio had pulled out on him, he'd been left with nowhere to shoot. I told him it wasn't necessary for him to pay for a room, that I could maybe find a place to stay, and even if I didn't, I was perfectly happy to pay for my own hotel room. Florian then gave me the date of his shoot, which was a couple of days away on a Friday evening. I happened to have been dating at the time. And it was just around the stage where it'd be acceptable for me to propose a kind of sleepover, if you will, and I proposed as such, and she accepted. So I had that Friday evening covered. I had no reason whatsoever to return to my apartment until, of course, I realized that I'd forgotten part of my laptop charger, the plug part that connects to the little box thing. There'd be no Starve Together land party unless I returned to the apartment to grab it. I briefly considered proposing a movie date instead, but the girl I was dating had seemed super excited to play, so I thought, screw it, and then caught the train back. I figured it'd be an hour at most, and then once I got back, we could get down to our land date. Plus, I called Florian in advance and gave him prior notice that I needed to stop the shooting for all of 30 seconds maximum, then be off the hook for any interruptions. I texted Florian as I was walking to the subway. Then when he didn't reply, I gave him a call once I was back in Bushwick. He didn't pick up on the first call, so I tried again. Only for that one to ring out too. I figured that he was busy, and his phone was set to do not disturb or whatever. So I texted him a second time saying that I was minutes away from the apartment and would only be interrupting him for like a minute max. Again, I got no reply, and I was kind of worried that my intrusion might cause some kind of issue between me and him. But at the same time, I was thinking, I pay my rent. I'm a good roommate. I can be in and out in 30 seconds with a few apologies. And if Florian's mad, well, I can just deal with that issue as and when it comes. A few seconds later, I'm at my apartment building, walking to the elevator. Then a minute more, I was at my door. Since I didn't want to disturb too much, I started knocking on the door. I had my key ready. But just like with the texts and calls, I wanted to give Florian as much advance notice as possible. I knocked once, got no answer, then tried calling Florian one last time. He sent that one straight to voicemail, so I knew that he knew that I was trying to get in touch with him. That's when I started to get a little annoyed. At least work with me, you know. Don't just ignore my calls. I get that he was busy, but he literally could have just grabbed my laptop cable, opened up the door and given it to me, and hey presto, He's back to his shit. But he didn't. He actively ignored me. So after a minute of waiting for a call or text, I took up my key and opened up my apartment's front door. The first thing I noticed upon closing the door behind me was that someone had tapped a bunch of clear plastic sheeting all over the place. They were on all the floors, on the walls, and there were strips hanging between open doorways like they were supposed to be flimsy replacements. I'm thinking, what the hell? And then I started calling out for Florian. The second I called out, I started hearing heavy footsteps coming towards the apartment's entrance hallway. They were walking with urgency, so right away I'm thinking, uh-oh, and I'm halfway to unleashing a string of apologies when two masked men stepped into view. They looked like nightclub security or something. Black suits, black shoes, black shirts, and black ties, all very well fitted. The only difference was these guys had these matte black masks on, real thick plastic by the looks of things. The moment they saw me, they started walking in my direction, and I'm like, wait, who the hell are you guys? But they didn't say anything. They lunged towards me, gripped me up, and then the next thing I know, they're slamming me down into the floor so hard it knocked the wind out of me. I'm lying there for a moment trying to catch my breath. Then when the fight comes back to me, I'm trying my best to buck them off, and I'm failing miserably. The whole time I'm yelling at the two guys, what the F are you doing? Get the hell off me. But again, they just completely ignore me and start yelling, intruder. I'm like, I get across this. I'm like, I'm not an intruder, I live here. And right then I hear the crackle of a stun gun before I feel this intense pain shooting up my leg. Suddenly, I can't move or talk anymore. I tried to carry on fighting when I realized that I could move again, but I was so frazzled from the stun gun that it felt like it drained my battery or something. There was nothing left in my tank, and all I could do was just lie there while those two heavies had me pinned, waiting until I had another opportunity to escape. I was still yelling for them to get off of me when someone down in the apartment's open sitting area, who I couldn't see, asked in a very authoritative voice tone what was going on. I immediately went quiet, then one of the two masked men repeated the same word, intruder, the person who spoke, whose voice I didn't recognize, then told them, remove me. The two heavies immediately dragged me into the hallway outside the apartment, dumped me on the ground, then went back inside and closed the door behind them. I was like, what the hell just happened? After I picked myself up, my first instinct was to call the cops. Something was going on in my apartment, and whatever it was, it didn't seem like any kind of movie set or whatever. My first thought was that it was some kind of home invasion, but then what was with all the clear plastic sheeting? They reminded me of something from Forensic Files, or Hostel, or the kind of Mexican cartels used in those kill houses so the walls and floors aren't soaked with blood. That's what freaked me out so much, that when I called the cops, I wasn't like, I'm pissed and those guys are going to pay. It was more like something terrible is happening up there in my apartment, and it's down to me to stop it. Yeah, I was angry at those two masked men for body slamming me and tasing me, but it wasn't like they were two crackheads who broke my nose after stealing my laptop. Another true story, the way those guys were dressed, the masks, all the plastic sheeting. They were security for something that was going on in there, something no one was allowed to see. In my humble opinion, that couldn't have been anything good and legal. In fact, screw legal. I've had neighbors growing pot back before it was legalized, and all the power to them. It's not hurting anybody. Land braces moved to part-time. But whatever I just walked into sure as hell looked like someone was either getting or was about to get hurt, and really badly too. The cops took a whole 20 minutes to get to me, and that's with the dispatcher telling me that mine was a priority call. They followed me up to my apartment, opened the door for them, and I was right in the middle of telling them about all the plastic sheeting when we saw it was all gone. Both cops gave me a disappointed look as if to say, we didn't have you down for a Skype with Brennick. Then right as I'm explaining how it was there not even 20 minutes ago, Florian appears with an explanation. He'd thrown a party, a rather exclusive one, and the two security guards his guests had employed had just been a little overzealous when it came to unexpected guests. According to Florian, there was never any plastic sheeting or black masks, and he wasn't sure what I was talking about in that respect. But what he was sure of was that he and his guests were profusely sorry for the confusion and that they wished to extend their sympathies for the inconvenience. I was angry. Like inconvenience, I was just assaulted. But then I noticed something else. Florian was showing more emotion and sincerity with the cops than he'd ever shown me. His natural state was dry and sarcastic, but with those two IPD officers, he was like the most articulate and passionate person ever. And that's when it hit me he wasn't being sincere. He was acting. The cops wanted to know who the two security guys were. the ones who ended up assaulting me. But Florian claimed that they were provided by an anonymous guest and that he had no idea who they were or where they'd been hired from. The only two people Florian knew, according to him anyway, were his male and female friend, both of whom would be happy to answer any questions the cops had when asked why all the guests had scattered before they arrived. Florian told the two officers that they were incredibly embarrassed at the confusion. He also seemed like he was being totally honest when he said that with his guests knowing their security would be in trouble with the cops. They walked out of the apartment building's back door to where their cars were waiting. I could see through Florian's bullcrap, and somehow by the time the two officers were leaving, they seemed convinced that Florian was as apologetic as he said he was and that it was all just some big misunderstanding. After the cops left, I asked Florian what had been going on the previous night. He changed his tone completely. He said I had no right to know what had been going on and that I shouldn't have come back to the apartment when I told him I'd stay away all night. He also added, in a way I found incredibly chilling, that I should consider myself lucky that nothing worse happened to me. I couldn't believe the sudden switch up. He put on such a good act for the cops that when he turned, it was like seeing him transform or shapeshift or something like that. He told me he wanted me to move out, and I told him I was planning on it. Then I spent the next few days searching for other places to live before finally finding one that suited my budget. I was lucky, though. I found somewhere decent pretty quick. And to be frank, I was close to living in my car because I did not feel safe around Florian anymore. To this day, I don't know what he and his friends were doing up there. And actually, I kind of don't want to know either. But that wasn't always the case. I used to spend many an hour trying to figure out what he was really doing because whatever it was, I didn't think it was anything even remotely innocent. I kept trying to get in touch with the other two cops I dealt with to see if there had been any updates, but it quickly became clear that they weren't remotely interested at all, and that they figured that I was some gatecrasher who'd probably got what was coming to him. At least that was the vibe I got. Because after all, this is New York City, a place where there's a major crime every 4 minutes. But if the walls of that apartment could talk, I bet they'd tell some truly terrifying tales. And these days, I'm happy not hearing a single goddamn one of them. I had to do something, and I had to do it right now. If Melanie was somehow a fake, that meant they must have sent her, and if they sent her, that meant they knew. They knew about the messages in her painting. They knew about me asking questions, and they knew I didn't hit a button during any of it. I felt panic and fear crawling up my chest, making it hard to breathe. Standing up, I started pacing, periodically glancing back at the monitor to see if Rachel could help me, tell me what I needed to do next. But she had laid down on her bed. It was hard to tell for sure with her back to the camera, but I think she was crying. No, I needed to fix this. Get her out of there. And if I didn't have a better plan, I just have to go with the one I already had, feeling the hard eye of the ceiling camera on me. I went to the door and stepped back into the locker room. My phone was in my locker, and after messing up the combination the first time, I got the door open and got it out, gripping it tightly. I tried to hold it by my side casually, but I knew there was little point. If they knew everything, I wasn't going to be able to hide anything. I just had to try and be fast, get some kind of message out to people that could help Rachel before they got to me. I opened the camera on the phone as I re-entered the surveillance room and hit record. It made a small beeping noise, and once I was sure it was recording, I turned the camera on myself. My name is Tommy, Thomas Calhoun. And my job is watching a woman trapped in a room. This is not a joke or a movie or whatever. This is real. For 3 years, my job is to sit in this room. I move the camera slowly around the room, taking in the door to the bathroom, the water cooler, the desk with the monitors, keyboard and button box, and watch a video feed of a woman locked up in a bedroom somewhere. I stepped closer to the desk and made sure the monitor showing Rachel was clear and in focus. I didn't know this woman was a prisoner at first, or I tricked myself into thinking she wasn't because the money was good. Either way, I know she is now. She is in danger, and so am I. After lingering on video of her for a few more seconds to make sure every detail could be seen, I turned the camera back on myself. I had to hurry or the video might be too big to send quickly. Italian was trying to stay calm, but I felt myself tearing up as I went on, and I did my best to keep my words clear. Please help her. I don't know where she is. I don't know who has her because I don't know who I really work for, but they are bad people and she is not safe. All I know is that I work at a building at Redacted right outside of San Antonio, per no sleep rules. To be clear, this address is not real. I only know the names of 2 other people connected to this place. The man who hired me, Mr. Solomon, and a man who might have a job like mine. Jeffries, I think. I don't know if they are real people. I mean, I don't know if that is their real names, please. I'm not crazy. I know how this sounds. Just come here, see the room, figure out where she is and help her. And I heard the muffled sound of the outer door opening into the locker room, and I frantically fumbled with the phone to stop the recording. How do I send? Oh no, how do I? There it is. I hit the button to share and felt a new panic rising. Who should I send it to? I had only a handful of contacts and I just selected them all. Maybe at least one of them would take it seriously and get help. As I heard the door to the surveillance room opening behind me, I hit send, not connected to data service or Wi-Fi. Please send again when connected. What? No. Sure. I turned to see Mr. Solomon entering the room. He was flanked by two large men in dark suits that looked like bodyguards or something. Raising a finger, he wagged it at me. No service in here, Thomas. But then you should never need service in here, so long as you followed the rules. They took me easily. I tried to make it to the bathroom and close the door, but the two guards stopped me and pulled me down. They put the, what do you call them? Zipped these on my hands and feet and pulled a black bag over my head. Then I was being carried out of the room, and it felt like they must have put me in the back of a van that was pulled right up to the building. I was laying on what felt like thin, weird-smelling carpet that covered a hard metal layer underneath. I heard someone get into the van with me, and I asked where we were going. If they would just take me and let Rachel go. There was a short laugh overhead, and then Mr. Solomon's voice as he told me that he would explain everything when we got where we were going. For now, he said I needed to relax. It was a long drive and I would need the rest. That would just say more. But then I felt a sharp pain in my neck. They had stabbed me, or no, they injected me with something. I was feeling so strange now, but I had to stay awake. I had to try and get away. I had to. Hello again, Thomas. I blinked as I began looking around. My mouth was dry and my head hurt, but otherwise I felt okay. I wasn't tied up anymore. Instead, I was laying back on a padded table like I'd seen when I went to the doctor. But this wasn't a doctor's office. The room was large, and aside from the padded table, it held a small bed, a desk with a computer monitor on it, and a couple of chairs. Sitting in one of those chairs was Mr. Solomon. I raised up slowly, blinking at him. Where is she? Is Rachel okay? The man smiled. You really are something, Thomas. Trying to be the hero even if you don't quite know how. I respect that. Licking his lips, he leaned forward slightly. In fact, I respect that so much that I've decided to start our new relationship with as much honesty as I'm allowed. Some of my colleagues disagree with this approach, but you know what? Fuck them. This is my project, and I think you deserve to know what's going on. Looking more serious, he stood up, lifting the gun he had been holding casually in his lap. But before we get into the details, would you like to see Rachel? I slid off the table and nodded as I caught myself from falling. My legs were still wobbly from whatever they had given me, but I barely noticed. Yes, please. Let me see her, the real her. Mr. Solomon gave a small laugh and gestured toward a nearby door. Yes, reality is always best. She's just there in the next room. I stumbled my way forward, my legs getting better as I walked. And when I grabbed the doorknob, it turned easily. I expected the door to lead to her bedroom, but instead it opened into another room a lot like the one I had been in, though the stuff in it was different. Strange machines filled the walls, and in the back of the room was a large aquarium I didn't know. It was a big cylinder taller than I was, and it was filled with some kind of gray liquid. There was a shape in that liquid. Go ahead, Thomas. Feel free to go have a good look. You've earned it. I felt my stomach clenching tighter at Mr. Solomon's words and the meanness in them. My legs felt heavy again now, but it wasn't from the drugs this time. Shuffling forward, I could see the shape was a person. Oh no, or at least a body, because it was clear from just looking at it that the person was dead. It was very well preserved, but I could see how the skin hung wrong and looked bloated in spots. Oh God, no, its hair, which had been floating like seaweed in front of its face, drifted away as I reached the glass, and I could see Rachel staring out at me. Murderer. I turned on Solomon and started to run toward him when he shot me. Suddenly, I was on the ground convulsing as he stepped closer. Don't worry, Thomas. It won't kill you, just make you unable to move much for a bit. I heard more footfalls as my body began to still. Get him up, take him back to the other room. I could barely feel anything as I was carried back to the padded table and propped up into a sitting position. This time I was strapped down, but I guessed it was more so I didn't fall off because I couldn't move anything other than my head, and even that just a little. I could hardly see at all for crying, but I recognized the blurry shape of Solomon sitting back down in front of me. Going before you ask, well, when you're able to ask anything again, yes, that is Rachel. Not a fake Rachel, not a dummy, and not some kind of trick. As I said, the time for tricks is past. Now is the time for truth. Frowning slightly, he went on. Thomas, I understand that showing you her body that way, might seem very cruel. You may hate me for it right now. I would understand it if you did. But you called me a murderer. And at least in this specific context, I think that is unfair because I didn't kill Rachel. In truth, I've been with this aspect of the project for only 7 years. He gestured back to the door behind him. And Rachel has been dead for over 8. I felt my eyes widen as though they belonged to someone else's body. It was more lies, more tricks, all of it. Oh God, it had to be. Do you know what remote viewing is? Well, he rolled his eyes. Sorry, right, you can't talk right now. I'll just assume you don't. Remote viewing is a broad term for the ability to see things that are far away from you, physically to know things you shouldn't be able to know through your normal 5 senses. Some describe it as a psychic ability, though there are several schools of thought as to how and why it works. His eyes fixed on mine intently, because it does work, Thomas. Various governments and private organizations have studied it for a very long time. And while publicly it is always ridiculed as pseudoscience and foolish superstition, the reality is that some people have the innate ability. That means it comes naturally to somehow see other. Rachel was one of those people. She came into the program when she was 17, having been identified via a front-facing screening process that was ran as a psychological test that paid subjects well at a time when Rachel was looking to make some money. 3 months after being identified as a good candidate, she was taken. And after the initial adjustment period, she became a largely compliant asset that quickly rose to the top of our talent pool. Solomon folded his hands on his knee. I know you cared for her, Thomas, so I think this is worth sharing. Rachel was never treated badly, other than her confinement and the occasional test that was mildly unpleasant. No, we all treasured her. She was enormously talented, not just as a remote viewer. Bonnie was an artist. That's how she would convey what she saw, you understand. She would enter into an almost trance-like state when she painted. And when she was done, she would have given us a painting of images and words that provided, well, it was very valuable information, he chuckled. You ever wondered? That's why there was always such care, that the paintings were never shown to the camera. Picking at his pants, he went on. Rachel was so talented that she was selected for a new program that we thought might greatly enhance or alter her ability. We introduced something foreign to her body. At first, nothing seemed to change. If anything, the accuracy of her remote viewing was declining, which was a problem for us and for her. Then we realized that we were reading the new paintings wrong. She was able to see more clearly than ever. She just was no longer bound to only current events. Now her sight transcended time. He paused and I realized he was enjoying telling the story. The bastard was having a good time. Pausing to make it more dramatic, I would fucking kill him, tries me. While this made some of her paintings less immediately useful, they became much more valuable as we were able to decipher them. For a time, it looked as though everything was working better than we had ever hoped. Her lips thinned, and then one day, she showed a painting to the camera and said, please help me, Thomas. This immediately sent up all kinds of red flags. She knew not to show paintings to the camera, and now she was trying to communicate with someone. We didn't disrupt her routine, but an intensive investigation began into who she was talking to. Was it one of her handlers, one of the technicians, someone from her past life? But nothing checked out. Leaning back in his chair, a look of pride grew on Solomon's face as he continued. I was the one that first suggested the idea that she was, intentionally or not, knowingly or not, seeing and talking to someone in the future. I was still an outside consultant at the time. But by that point, we had more strange behaviors from her, including the second message painted, that girl isn't me. My theory made some sense, but it very quickly ran into a greater obstacle. The introduction of the foreign material had not been as seamless as we had hoped. Despite her having been stable for almost 3 years since it was implanted, whether it was due to her increasing emotional upset and stress, or simply the passage of time, she suddenly began to deteriorate. Her work became more erratic and hard to understand as her body began to decline. We were monitoring her health closely, but it didn't matter. 5 days after she painted That Girl Isn't Me, she suddenly went into cardiac arrest and died. Somewhat inexplicably, we were unable to resuscitate her, the man sighed. This was a great loss, and it required adjustments of my theory. Based on everything we knew, it still made sense that she was talking to someone with access to the camera feed, and very likely someone named Thomas. If Thomas was viewing that camera footage in the future, as I believed, then he must be working for us in the future. He gave me a thin smile. And whether you believe that the future is set in stone or not, I'm all for giving it a helping hand. 7 years ago, I began the Thomas Project. Over the course of that time, I have overseen the screening and hiring of 43 men named Thomas at several different sites, all with one very specific job: to watch the videos of Rachel from just before her implant to the time of her death. I tried to speak, but my mouth still wouldn't work. I wanted to say he was lying, that it didn't make sense, that it was another trick. But I think I wanted to hear it more for myself, because I didn't think he was lying. I didn't think it was a trick, and I thought I was starting to understand. The point wasn't really them watching the videos, of course. It was how they reacted to watching the videos, what they did, and how that matched up with what Rachel had done in response in the past. 13% quit after the first day. 38% hit either the red or the green button after the first message asking for help and saying their name. 22% attempted to contact the authorities before reaching the stage where Milani was introduced. He shook his head slightly. I wish I could take credit for her introduction, but it wasn't my suggestion. We assume from the Sachi and the Mo, "It girl isn't me" message that there was a double of Rachel introduced to you at some point, perhaps to kill you or dissuade you or find out what you knew. But it took a few tries until we felt it was well refined. And as I've pointed out, only 27% made it that far, and all of them failed the next test. He pointed at me, her name. So, you see, the girl you've been watching, that talented, wonderful girl whose body is preserved in the next room, her name was Rachel Donovan. I had always wondered if Rachel was merely seeing you or if there was some kind of connection between the two of you. When you called Milani Rachel, I knew that we had finally found the right Thomas. The distant point of light that our Rachel was looking at across space and time. I swallowed thickly and found I could feel my tongue, if only a little. Slurring badly, I pushed out a single word. Why? Solomon looked surprised. I'd have thought they'd be clear by now. You're our only remaining link to one of our greatest treasures. Perhaps you have a similar ability, or it may be that she forged the link purely through her own talent and will. But either way, you are important and you have more work to do. He stood up and moved over to the table where he turned on the monitor. As it came to life, I saw it was a frozen image of Rachel's room. A tape paused where I had left off watching. Turning back to me, the man looked solemn. Dear, you have to watch the rest of it, because Rachel painted you more pictures before she died, and we have to know what they mean. Addiction took our mother slowly, rocked her through it, and sung her to sleep, sunk deep into the mattress on her bed. When her back teeth fell out, she left them on the side of the bathtub. I was 7, and I kept them in a matchbox. The missing pieces of her kept safe, so she wouldn't be lost forever. So maybe one day, we could put her back together. Our house fell down around us, and we tried our best to raise ourselves. The ceilings had water damage, and the bottom stairs had dry rot, and in the winters, the radiators would bleed rust, but it was still our house, and Annie made it a home. My sister Annie mothered me with lopsided Band-Aids on bruised knees and lukewarm microwave meals. She told me ghost stories and didn't mind when I crawled into her bed later on, too scared to sleep alone. She taught me to dance, barefoot on the living room carpet, music channel on full volume on the TV, shaking our hips before they were fully grown. She always let me shower first, so the water was hot, never complaining when she had to make do with cold. She brushed my hair every day before school, even when I screamed and hit her when she caught the tangles. Annie was dark-haired like her father, whoever he had been, but I was blonde. Annie was desperate to be blonde too, like Marilyn Monroe. Like Mom, I think she thought it would make them closer, remind Mom less of her dad. I'd give anything for her to have her hands in my hair one more time, even if it hurt. She moved to New York when I turned 18 and never came back. Grandma said Telpy was in, I still dream about her sometimes. Keeping up with our mother was impossible. And we learned from a young age, we would always be left behind. It didn't make it any easier when she was drinking light. She shone, would wake us up at 3 a.m. with pancakes dripping in cherry syrup, sometimes when the weather was right. And she'd had enough being drunk. Alone, she would call our school up and tell them we had both come down with summer sickness and we'd drive to the beach instead. I remember being 9 years old in the backseat of the car coming home after one of our ocean days, sucking the salt from my fingers. Annie had just dyed her hair blonde, her best friend Jane helping her bend over our kitchen sink. From behind, I couldn't tell who was mother and who was daughter. Radio up and windows down, blowing the sky inside. When she was drinking heavy, she'd be out all night, hair piled up like a beauty queen, eyes glazed over and ringed with glitter and black. Sometimes she'd be gone a day or two. She would never tell us when. One day, we'd just wake up to an empty house and the fridge packed full. Post-it note on the front with a smear of Mom's lipstick in the outline of a kiss, telling us she'd be back soon. Sometimes she'd bring guys home, filling the table with beer cans and ashtrays. Smoke up to the ceiling, Mom lost in the haze. We'd sleep with pillows over our heads, trying to drown out the music they would blast until the M, and wake up to strangers at our kitchen table in the morning. asking us where we kept the coffee. So when Mom drank too little, she fell apart. She wouldn't buy food. Refrigerator, a gaping hole in the wall. She chain smoked, leaving cigarette burns on the wallpaper up by the stairs like the walls were sick and decaying. She barely slept, walking around with blue half-moons under her eyes, knuckles raw. She would scream at the slightest thing. I remember once when I spilled a glass of juice on the couch. She looked over at me with dead eyes and dragged me off onto the carpet and then took every single cushion off the couch and into the backyard and set them on fire. Annie went to watch a while from the window and then sat next to me on the floor, backs pressed against the skeleton of the seats, head resting in the crater of my collarbones. When Mom drank too much was the worst. She'd laugh too loud and too long at anything and everything until her mouth started to shake, and she started crying at the breakfast table into her cereal. Danny shut down. When Mom was like this, went somewhere deep inside herself where nobody could hurt her. She'd stay up until the morning watching old black and white movies on TV, whispering the lines she knew by heart like prayers. It's like when I was 5, I'd cry when I'd find Mom passed out cold on her bed. Sure, she would never wake up. Annie would wipe my tears, tell me she was only sleeping just like the princess who would by storybook. We sit on Mom's bed together and wait for her to wake up. When we were older, I was the one who would pick Mom up off the bathroom floor again and again, and Annie would put her to bed, smoothing her hair off her face and the vomit from her mouth, changing her clothes if she'd pissed herself. Watching them then, there was no doubt that Annie was the mother now. It was October and I was 13. Annie 16. It was a Wednesday night and Mom had been gone for 2 days. She'd called us that morning from a payphone, voice slurring down the line, telling us she was having the best time with all her new friends, hoped we were doing fine. When she asked me if I was having a good birthday, I hung up on her. My birthday had been the day before. Annie had given me a pile of presents, strawberry lip glosses and glittery nail polishes. I didn't ask where she got the money for them. I didn't care. We'd taken the bus to the beach with Jane, eaten the birthday cake she had made for me, sand getting into the frosting. It tasted like sweetness in the sea, and I savored every bite and scrape of sugar against my teeth. Counting, we watched the sun go down. Any snapping, grainy photos on her shitty Nokia as I blew out my candles, wishing over and over that Mom wouldn't come home, that she'd just stay gone this time. First, for it to be plucked that Wednesday night, me and Annie weren't speaking. Anger hung heavy between us, seeping through the floorboards. It began when she tripped at the bottom of the stairs. We'd both laughed. Annie throwing her head back, gap between her front teeth catching the light. When I'd bent to pick her up, I'd caught her breath warm against the freckles on my cheeks. I let go of her arms and she fell again, hitting the floor and grinning, shaking her hair from her face. Her breath was heavy with whiskey, 3 towers in reality. I couldn't start picking her up, too. Couldn't watch her fall again and again. Just like Mom, I knew she'd never get back up. I'd stared down at her, blonde hair falling into her eyes, and all I could see was our mother. And then I was running, feet slamming the hallway like heartbeats turned loose. I ran for the kitchen and tipped every bottle we had down the sink, shoving Annie back as she fought to stop me, catching liquor on her fingers as it fell. She grabbed my shoulders and made me drop the very last bottle. And this lapring that smashed between us on the floor, glass shards shining like we dragged the stars out of the sky and broken them. Pieces we could never put back. Outside through the open windows, the sky turned pale gold, clouds a mess of pink and cream smeared across the horizon. I cried then, watching Annie on her knees picking up the pieces. There was Annie, always trying to fix things even when it was too late. The smell of food dragged me from my room, stomach turning traitor inside my ribcage. Annie was cooking pasta, real food not made in a microwave. She'd set the table, Tammy Wynette singing softly from the CD player. Annie gently swaying her hips as she stirred the tomato sauce, rich and warm, as we ate in silence. With every bite, I forgave her. Mom never cooked dinner or remembered my favorite was spaghetti ever since I was a kid or stayed sober long enough to sit up at a table. Annie wasn't Mom. We were washing the dishes when we first heard it. A moth was crawling down the inside of the pane, and I cracked the window to let it out into the dark. From the backyard came a faint sound. I tilted my head to listen as it was coming from far off. Crying, I figured it was Mika, the 2-year-old next door, having a tantrum loud enough for us to catch, or maybe even Lucky Strike the cat that junkies down the street, begging for food like he sometimes did. I always wanted to feed him when he came around, winding over my ankles, but Annie always stopped me, saying once you started giving, they never stopped taking. Looking back, I don't think she was talking about the cat. Annie flipped the Christmas lights strung up around the porch, and we sat on the plastic beach chairs watching the skies. When we were little, we'd sit outside and Annie would tell me the names of all the constellations and the stories of how they came to be hung up in the night sky. I had to grow up before I realized she made them all up as she went along. It was a game we still liked to play, now making up ridiculous stories for the shapes we could pick out. Ah yes, that one there's the Coors Light. It got there when God dropped it out of his convertible window and never picked it up, she said, nodding sagely and hiding her smile. Of course, I said, waving my hands and pointing up past the power lines. Right next to the ashtray, left there by angels on a smoke break. Yeah, they say if you wish on it, all your dreams will come true, said Annie, grinning. She stopped laughing, voice quieter, face tilted up to all those dead stars. Let's wish, Emmy. Let's wish, so we did. And the sound of crying interrupted us. It was closer this time, and definitely human. We turned to each other, confused. Annie shrugged and I squinted out into the black. It sounded like a baby, lost and tired and alone. Eerily, must be Micah, said slowly getting to my feet. Maybe he walked around the back. Shit, do you want to call Connie and tell her we'll bring him over? Annie didn't reply, and I sighed, rolling my eyes. Guess I'll do everything then. I stepped off the porch, grass soft against my heels. The air smelled like it might rain, fresh and clean and growing. A promise unfulfilled. Annie's voice was strained. I turned to her, smiling. It died on my face when I saw the look on her own. Em, get inside now. She was staring out into the dark past me, opening the door with one hand behind her, fingers fumbling on the catch. I froze, barefoot in the dirt. I'd found what she was looking at. In the bushes by the back fence was a person crouched with their knees tucked up neat under the chin, arms wrapped around legs. Their mouth hung wide, softly opening and closing as he cried. Like a child lost in the dark. Not like a child, but of someone pretending. Mimicking the sound, open and closed out in the blackness. Suddenly they straightened, snapping upright face still hidden by the black. They were tall and thin, too thin to be a normal person. So panic made me move. Animal instincts left over from the days we lived up in the trees carrying me forward. I was faster than Annie, dragging her inside and slamming the door behind us. Hearing it bounce on its hinges as I locked it. So we watched as the person slowly walked towards the house, steps deliberate and long. Annie reached for my hand, holding me tight and turned me to face her, holding my shoulders. Don't turn around, Emmy. Don't turn around. Instinctively, I started to look over my shoulder, out into the darkness. Annie grabbed my face hard and shook her head. I knew then she was serious. I emerged in intonation. Her voice cracked and she cleared her throat, gripping my hand tight enough to hurt, nails digging in, grounding herself. I looked down at our fingers interlocked. Both of us grown from the same bones. I'm gonna call the cops and everything is going to be. Her voice faltered, stuttering. Tears spilled over her lashes, dripping like the promise of rain. Annie never cried. Your phone's on the porch, she whispered, and bile crawled its way up my throat. Her phone was upstairs, charging. A soft tap, tap, tapping filled the silence. Annie turned to the window, eye whites showing her eyes were so wide. It was the sound of someone's forehead against the glass. Slowly, over and over, they started to speed up faster and harder, skin meeting glass, until they was slamming into window hard enough to shake the panes. The tapping stopped and I was about to ask Annie if I could look now when she screamed, followed by the sound of cracking glass and the loudest slam yet. Whoever was in our yard had just smashed their face hard enough into the window to break it. Everything ran upstairs, two at a time, skipping the ones caved in with dry rot on instinct. I turned behind me once and Annie yanked my face back before I could see. The sound of broken glass echoed behind us as we made it to the bathroom. Locking the door, the thin wailing cry, like a baby calling for its mother, filled the hallway, trapped between the walls and locked doors. Annie threw her back against the door, football and unit jammed up against the bathtub, clutching the knife she had grabbed from the kitchen. I did the same shoulder to shoulder, slow footsteps started on the stairs, deliberate and casual, crying to become mocking, almost laughter, shrill bursts of sound and then giggles, high-pitched and abruptly stopping before starting again. The first door on the upstairs floor was my bedroom, and we heard the distinct sound of it slamming open. They were looking for us. Says, what the fuck is going on? I asked Annie, not even bothering to brush away the tears that I couldn't stop falling. I watched my sister pick herself up off the floor and brace her hands on the door as we heard the sound of a second door slamming open. Mom's room, the next room on the hallway, was the bathroom. Annie pulled me to my feet and handed me the knife. I shook my head and pushed it back to her, terrified of what would happen if I had to use it. Annie shoved me and pressed the knife into my hands, thumb pressing hard enough on the blade to bleed. I watched my sister's blood drip down her wrist, a winding red road still pushing into my hands despite the pain. I took the knife. You got copying about it. Something slammed against the wall that Mom's room shared with the bathroom. A high-pitched wail followed. I held my breath, could feel my heart beat in the base of my throat, a wild and frantic thing. I'm gonna get the phone from my room. I shook my head violently, about to argue. Annie clamped a hand over my mouth. I could taste the blood on her hand, salty and sweet, like birthday cake by the ocean. Yes, I'm going to get the phone, and I'm going to call the cops, and we're going to be okay. I shook my head again. It's the only way. When I go, I need you to lock the door and you don't open it for anything or anyone, not for me, not for her. I shook my head and Annie pressed her hand into my mouth, crushing my teeth against my lips, so it made my eyes water. Yes, promise me, Something smashed in the room next door. Annie brushed the hair off my face, gently tucking it behind my ear. Promise, she mouthed, and unlocked the door as slowly as possible, bolt scraping gently. I watched the curve of her shoulder disappear into the black hole outside, like the moon in eclipse. And then she was gone. I couldn't move or breathe for a second, and then I slammed the bolt shut just as something bounced off the outside of the door. A high-pitched scream followed, handle rattling up and down hard enough to pop one of the screws. I watched it roll towards me on the tiles. And then silence. I sat with my back to the door, holding the knife and wishing I was holding Annie's hand instead. Still silence, nothing but me and my lungs slowly filling the room with my breath. Yeah, came a voice through the door. I started, hands gripping the knife. Honey, what's going on? Mom? My voice cracked. Mom, is that you? I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking, trying to keep myself still. Sweetie, it's okay. Just open the door. It's okay. Just let me in. And the handle rattled again, gentler. Just let me in. It's all okay. She banged on the door and I took my handle of the bolt. Honey, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed your birthday. I'm sorry I'm such a terrible mother. Please, her voice broke. And she started to cry. Just let me in, baby. I'm so sorry. I screwed my eyes shut. She sounded so sad and so lost. I just wanted her to hold me like when I was a kid and I'd come in off the swings with a scraped knee. Maybe this time she meant it. Maybe it would all be okay. My hand found its way to the bolt again. My sister's voice came through the door, warm and gentle. Yeah, Emily, let us in. It's all okay. My hand froze on the bolt, and I tightened my grip on the knife. Annie never called me by my full name. A hand banged on the door, handle rattling. Emily, let us in. Annie's voice became low and guttural, followed by the same shrill giggles from before. Mom spoke now, pleading, crying, voice getting louder and louder. Let us in, let us in, let us in, over and over again, punctuated by her fists on the door. I thought about demons and monsters, all the bedtime stories we prayed. Don't crawl out from under the bed. That's not my sister and you're not my mother. You screamed through the door, hands over my head. I climbed into the bathtub and curled in a ball, cradling myself, knife clutched to my chest. I didn't know what it was outside that door, but I knew it wasn't Annie. Anyway, wasn't the voice that yelled at. When I changed TV channel, the one that sang me happy birthday, the one that told me I was smart even when I got bad grades, the one that read me stories about princesses that never wake up. It wasn't human. You kids saw the bangs and yells came from downstairs, followed by the footsteps of people running. A low guttural howl ripped through the house, filling the room until I felt like I was drowning in the sound. And then the door was kicked in, a scream covering my eyes, waiting to die. Arms found me and lifted me from the tub, carrying me from the room. I looked at the outside of the door as I was carried downstairs. It was covered in long scraping claw marks, dragged down to the floor. Pillows ripped apart covered the hallway in soft down, like it had snowed inside. I watched them drift slowly as men in uniforms checked each of the rooms that looked like they had been torn apart by something feral. Outside in our driveway were police cars and an ambulance. In the middle of it all was Annie, bathed in blue and red light as it washed over her, lit up in the dark like a neon angel, face aglow. I threw myself from the cop's shoulder and ran to her, holding us both together, broken pieces and all, standing under all those constellations we made up. Gentle screaming came from the ambulance, which rocked occasionally. Annie gently turned my head away, smiling so sadly, it made my chest ache as I understood. Turns out there was no demon, no wild animal or bad men trying to break in. Just Mom out of her mind on booze and drugs and everything in between, coming to the end of a week-long binge. Something had finally broken inside her head. And this time we couldn't put her back together no matter how hard we tried. Sometimes you fall one last time and you never get back up. Annie had seen her in the garden, blood dribbling from her mouth, track marks bulging on her forearms, like unmapped roads, rail-thin and desperate for one more hit, one more fix. She'd searched the kitchen for all the drink I'd thrown away, and when she hadn't found it, had come to hunt for the stash she hid in the bathroom. She hadn't wanted me, just the drugs on the other side of the door, so high she could mimic Annie's voice almost perfectly. Turns out the real monsters are the ones that eat you alive slowly, the kind that come in a bottle or a needle or at the end of a long list of reasons why you can't get out of bed in the morning. Sometimes the monsters are the ones that raise you or love you the most, Bertie, but it's up to you if you let them in. I'm a nurse and I currently work nights. It's a total drag, but I'm hopeful I can go today soon, since some coworkers are planning retirements. Anyway, I was working one night when just at 3 a.m. and my son's monitor alerted me to sound and movement. No big deal at all. He probably coughed loudly or sneezed or something. He's 3 now, so he generally sleeps all night. I bring it up on my phone and I see him and my wife sitting on the bed. Again, no big deal. He might have cried out or gotten scared or something. I was about to close the app when I noticed they were acting strange, almost creepy. And when I say almost creepy, I mean creepy as balls. They were sitting on the bed together, both of them just staring up at the camera with blank, emotionless stares. Night vision is black and white, so they had white, eerie-looking eyes. They didn't move at all aside from their visible breathing. They just sat there staring at the camera. I close the app and give my wife a call to make sure everything is okay. I never get to call home on lunch, so in a way this is kind of nice to get to talk to my family while at work. It rings a couple times before she answers with a very groggy hello. It was like she was dead asleep when I called, and she looked wide awake when on the camera. Hey, you guys okay? Huh. Yeah, buddy. My son's nickname came in like 15 minutes ago. Seemed scared, so I said he could sleep with Mama. I'm confused here since I saw them in his room a minute ago. Literally 60 seconds had passed since I closed the app and made the call. Wait, so you guys are in bed? Yeah, I fell back asleep right away. Everything okay? Everybody keeps waking me up. She's kind of annoyed. Hang on a sec, I put her on speaker and bring up the app, hoping I don't see it. When the app loads, I get that pang of intense nervousness in my stomach that I haven't had in a long time since I was a kid in school, and realized while I was eating breakfast a paper or something was due that day and I hadn't done it. My heart leaps into my throat. My wife and son are sitting on his bed looking up at the camera. Same emotionless stares. Hello? You guys are in bed, right? Yeah, we're trying to sleep. Well, I'm looking at his camera, and I see you two sitting on his bed. Huh? No, we're in our bed. I know that's what you mean. But I'm looking at his bed, and you two are in there. Hang on, she says. She's quiet for a second while she brings up the camera on her phone. I hear this guttural, terrified gasp, like she had sucked all the air in the room into her lungs, filling them to capacity. I don't hear this kind of gasp from my wife often, usually only when she's truly afraid, like during a jump scare in a movie or one time when we turned our back on our son for literally a second and he was down by the mailbox inches from the road. I hear rustling of sheets and the line goes dead. Of course, now I'm absolutely terrified myself, so I immediately call back. It goes to voicemail, so I call again. I call again and again with no answer. Finally, after about 4 minutes, she calls me. I tell you that 4 minutes felt like 40 years. Hey, what's happening? I ask. She's absolutely hysterical and crying. I can't understand a word she says. Stop. Slow down for just a second, I say. She slows down enough to explain. They are in the car and driving to her parents. He looked at the camera. And when she saw what was on it, she got up and grabbed our son and rushed downstairs and out the door. Didn't even close the garage. Don't worry about it, I said. I'll drive by when I get off and close it. We live in a generally safe neighborhood, so I'm not too concerned the door is up. You will not go in there, she says. Hell no, I return. Disagree. Why are we on the camera, she asked. Is it a recording? I don't know, I return. I'm going to keep watching it and see if there's anything I can tell. Do our code words with Buddy. We have code words because we're nerds. We've seen too many pod people and imposter movies, so we decided a long time ago to make code words with each other to be able to tell if one of us was an imposter. We have a couple code words, but we also have a 3-sentence story we recite together, each saying a different part alternately of each other. I hear her on the phone, saying the things we taught our son. He giggles as he says them. He does every time we practice, since he thinks they're a joke and doesn't have any idea of the real meaning. We're both convinced he's our son. My wife then says our part, and I'm convinced she's her. We made up these words as a complete joke to ourselves. I never once in my life ever imagined we'd actually need them. Unreal. She got to her parents safely, and it was hard to hang up. I told her we'll figure it out in the morning, hopefully just a glitch. She said she didn't think it was a glitch. When she was running out, she had to run by our son's room and the door was open. There's a little flashing light on the back of the camera that indicates it's connected to the internet. It gives off just enough light that when she ran by, she thought she saw, out of the corner of her eye, a shadowy outline of what could have been an adult sitting on our son's bed. It sends chills down my spine to think about. Knowing they were safe and out of the house is the only thing that kept me at work that night. It was a long 4 hours, but I kept checking the camera every chance I got. Sure enough, they were still sitting on the bed, staring up at the camera with emotionless gazes. I studied them to see if I could see any pattern, from their breathing to their blinking. Their breathing was steady and looked normal. It was their blinking that would tell me if this was just some kind of bizarre, time-looped freak accident video or not. I intently stare at my phone and count the seconds between each blink, telling myself if this is a loop, then their blink should be even and occur at the same time each time. There was no pattern to their blinking. It was erratic and random, just as a person blinking should be. The passing hours are what finally sealed the deal that this was not a weird loop video of some kind. My son's window's visible on camera, and I can see on camera that it is getting lighter outside his room. His curtains keep out just enough light to prevent the camera from exiting night vision, but lets in just enough to be able to tell the sun is rising. I try to figure out what the hell I'm going to do before I leave work. Calling the police comes to mind as I talk myself out of it. First of all, what am I supposed to say? Someone is in my house that looks like my wife but isn't. Worse yet, what if they're entities of some kind and the police do go over, it kills them or something? I decide to tell coworker about it. He's a firm believer in the paranormal and might have a suggestion. I show him the video and tell him the story. His initial response of "that's creepy as fuck" doesn't help much, but he says he wants to go over and check it out. He says we both should to see if not my wife will try and act like my wife. I tell him absolutely not, and he says we should at least go to the house, even if we don't go in. I agree on that since I wanted to close the garage. I got to my house and walked around the perimeter first. Not sure what we wanted to accomplish by that, but it felt like something we should do. The curtains were all drawn since nobody was there to open them in the morning, so we couldn't see anything. I went to close the garage and suddenly had this overwhelming urge to go inside and investigate. It was like I just had to know what was going on. So when we went, there he walked through the kitchen towards the foyer where the stairs are. It's so quiet in our house right now. You could hear a feather drop. Forget the pin. We stop at the bottom of the stairs and wait a few seconds. I look at the camera again and they are still sitting there. I've never been so scared in my life. My coworker puts his foot on the first step and I suddenly say, "Stop," loudly. "Forget this. We're out of here," I tell him. "Come on." I start making my way back to the kitchen. I hear a loud creak in the floor from upstairs. It's my son's room. He has a very loud creaky board right in the middle of his floor that's almost impossible not to step on. My wife and are still deciding if we ever want to fix it, because it will alert us if he's ever up to no good when he gets older trying to sneak out or something. "Come on, come on, come on," I yell as I motion for him to move his ass. We're out of the house in about 2 seconds. Out on the street, I checked my phone. Now, only not my son was sitting on the bed, same blank stare. Not my wife was gone. "Holy shit!" My coworker says. That was stupid as fuck of us. Do not tell my wife we went inside. She would be so ungodly mad if she found out what we just did. Use my garage door opener in my car to close the door. Before we leave, I look at the camera again. Not my wife is back on the bed with not my son, both staring blankly up at the camera, blinking every few seconds. It was all about 4 days ago now. Not my wife and not my son are still sitting on the bed staring up at the camera. They haven't moved a millimeter. We obviously haven't gone back to our house. What do we do? The day we finally called the cops would be day 6. Not my family was still sitting on the goddamn bed, staring at the camera. I told the dispatcher there were intruders in my house, leaving out the part where they looked exactly like my family. I told her we were out of the house, but I would meet the police there. She dispatched 2 units. My wife begged me not to go. I told her I had to be there. I had a foolproof plan. I would take her mom's iPhone and FaceTime with my wife while showing the police the camera on my phone. They would see this as a fucked up situation and hopefully proceed with caution. My coworker friend said he would come with me as well. My friend and I beat the cops to my house. Like most of you mentioned in the comments previously, I was packing heat. I have a concealed carry, so I had my 1911 .45 on me. I was not concerned this would bother the cops, as I was going to inform them my permit and that I was currently carrying. What I wasn't going to tell them was that I had my father-in-law's AR-15 in my trunk. It's almost funny how many of you mentioned that was the way to go in my previous entry. I didn't plan on telling the cops about it because I was not planning on needing it. They would come armed and prepared. They showed up and I let them know I was armed and then enacted my plan. I initially told them the story. They looked at each other like I was crazy and they didn't believe me. I FaceTimed my wife so they could see she was in fact not in the house despite what our camera was showing. They still didn't seem to believe me, but this did pique their interest. I hung up with my wife and told her I'd call her back as soon as we knew something. So now we're sure this isn't a recording. An officer stated repeating what I said. It's not. The day-and-night cycle has changed every day. Their blinking is erratic and not cyclical like it was a repeat. I said, "I know it's a stupid question, but your wife isn't a twin?" The other officer asked. I told him. My friend spoke up. I have an idea. Turn the volume up. I'll go through a pebble at the window. He went around back while I turned up the volume to the max. Okay, I'm tossing. We heard the light tick sound from outside, but the 1 second delay on the camera came in loud and clear through my phone. Not my wife moved at the sound of the pebble hitting the window. The first time I'd actually seen her move aside from the time she wasn't on screen. When I initially went inside our house the first day, she turned her head towards the window, just slightly, before turning back to the camera. Okay, so this is live, an officer said. Okay, sir, I need you and your friend to stay outside here. We're going to go in and find out what's going on here. Should you ask for more units? I asked, hopefully. Not at this time. We're going to assess the situation first. They don't appear to be armed, but we're going to be cautious. I opened the garage for them, and they made their way in towards my kitchen door. They radioed dispatch that they were headed in and to stand by. They disappeared into my house a few seconds after they went and the camera went out. I wanted to vomit, and I felt like if I put my fingers in my mouth, I'd be able to feel my heart since it had leapt so far up into my throat. Shit, I yelled to my friend. I immediately popped the trunk and got my rifle out and ran into the garage, my friend right behind me. We got inside just in time to hear a low, guttural howl from upstairs, demonic sounding almost, along with raised voices from the police. There were several shots. Need backup shots fire was cut off. Oh my God, my friend howled. He was scared shitless, but so was I. God fucking damn it, I knew it. I said, running up the stairs. My son's room is the first one you come to after getting upstairs. So his wall is also what you see as you walk up the stairs. As I reached the top, I laid into the wall with my rifle. It is a 30-round magazine, but I felt like I fired 100 shots. I fired all over the place, knowing full well the ammo would go through the wall like it was paper, concentrating on where my son's bed would be, but also near the door and towards the floor as well in case whatever these things were thought to duck. We heard shrieks of pain coming from the room, then nothing. My friend and I paused for a minute before deciding to go in because the camera was still out. We heard a whimpering coming from the room. There was a dead cop in the hallway we had to step over. It was awful, and I'll never be able to unsee it. His head was several feet away from his body in the threshold to our guest room. We found the other cop in my son's room, right inside the doorway. He had several large holes in his torso as if he'd been impaled. Exactly what I was afraid would happen had happened. I called the cops, and whatever these things were killed them. Just when we entered the room, we found the source of the whimpering was not my wife. She was laying on her back on the floor, holding her torso that was bullet-ridden and breathing heavy. The scene was awful. I can hardly put into words how awful it was. I know now, just like I did then. They weren't my family. It shouldn't have been hard. I should have been able to just go in and finish it, but instead I fell to my knees. Not my wife begged for her life. I don't want to die, honey, she whimpered. I wanted to have more kids. I can't die now. I looked over at not my son, who had to be dead. He'd taken 2 shots at least to the head, or what was left of it. He had several more in his torso and 1 or 2 on his legs and arms. If you have kids, seeing their lifeless, bullet-ridden body is a special kind of hell. Again, I knew it wasn't my son, but I was going to be sick. I'd killed my family. I turned back to not my wife. She was acting just like my wife. It even mimicked her anxiety about death that she has had in the past year or so. It's not her, man. I forgot my friend was even there. It's not her, shoot it. I know what you guys are thinking. How many times has this happened in the movies and you scream at your TV for the main character to just shoot the imposter because it's not their loved one? I guess movies get it right somehow. I'll never roll my eyes at the character who can't kill an imposter again. Please don't shoot me, it begged. My hands were shaking as I aimed at it. Why couldn't I do it? I knew this wasn't my wife. Listen, man, my friend began calmly. Look at it. Its blood is yellow. It's not your family. Was it yellow? It was. Seeing my family slain was so traumatic. I hadn't even noticed their blood wasn't red. I steadied my aim and not my wife suddenly stopped begging. She began that guttural, terrifying shriek, and something black or gray started to protrude from her mouth like a tentacle or something, and I fired. And at that range, her head more or less exploded. Whatever these things were, they appeared to be mortal. I was still on my knees and my friend was out in the hallway just outside the door. We heard the sounds of approaching police sirens. I'd forgotten one of the cops had gotten a shots fired call over the radio before being killed. It seemed like it had been hours, but it had only been about 5 minutes since the police had gone in. My friend went downstairs to let the police know what to expect. I stood up and slowly made my way into the hallway. I was lightheaded and felt like I was going to be sick. My bedroom is adjacent to my son's, so the doorway is about a foot to the right of my son's doorway. My door was closed, but as I exited my son's room, my door opened. Not me walked out into the hallway wearing exactly the same thing I was at that time. I was shocked in place. I couldn't move, but it did. It walked towards me, and its right arm turned black and morphed into what appeared to be a tentacle. It was wiggling around like a squid or octopus appendage. When he thrust his arm at me, it solidified and impaled me through my abdomen. It then stabbed me in the left leg just above the kneecap and fell to the ground in pain. Its tentacle arm was wiggling again. "Why did you kill my family?" it asked. When it spoke, its voice changed pitch several times. It was my voice, then much deeper, then normal again. It alternated several times, saying that one sentence. It moved in closer. The rifle was gone by. I still had my .45. I pulled it out and got a shot off in its right knee. It howled. As Not Me fell to his knee, I fired a couple more shots, getting 2 into its abdomen and left side of its ribs. It breathed heavily for a few seconds before I used the last of my strength to aim proper and shot Not Me in the face. Its blood was also yellow. I lay there bleeding out, thinking this was it for sure. I still had some strength from adrenaline kicking in, so I took my belt off and tried to make a tourniquet for my leg. With my stomach wound, it was hard to give it a good yank to tighten it. I then took my shirt off and balled it up and packed my stomach wound and applied as much pressure as I could. Being a nurse probably saved my life. I passed out, but the measures I took must have kept me alive long enough for Emma's to arrive. I heard raised voices and the sound of pounding coming up the stairs before I went out. It was probably a cop, but I felt pressure from somebody trying to keep my wound packed before I went out. I was in and out of consciousness as EMS arrived, along with probably every cop in the city. I was wheeled downstairs and put in an ambulance. But while I was being loaded onto the gurney upstairs, I heard cops freaking out. And rightfully so. They'd lost 2 brothers and there were 3 other bodies. Did he kill his brother? Are they twins? Probably referring to Not Me's dead body, or his whole family. Put him on armed guard while at the hospital, he'll probably be getting charged. As I was getting placed into the ambulance, I saw my friend talking to a group of about 10 cops, all listening very intently to what he was saying. I went out again in the ambulance. I woke up in the ER and my wounds had been treated. The tentacle hadn't been more than a few inches wide, so it was just slightly larger than a large knife. They'd sewn me up, and I found that I was currently receiving a blood transfusion due to blood loss at my home. My wife had authorized them to do whatever they had needed while I was unconscious. She was also extremely pissed that I went in the house. We're okay now, but that's a story for another day. I was in the hospital for 3 weeks since I ended up getting an infection and almost went septic. I needed quite a few antibiotics. For the entire 3 weeks, I had cops in my room with questions. After about a week, they released me and no longer had me under armed guard. I told them absolutely everything, not caring if it made sense or not. And thank God my friend had come with me, since he was able to corroborate this weird story. Midway through my hospital stay, men with suits came to pay me a visit. They were government. I knew right away. They said they were FBI, but I don't know if I believe that. They wanted to talk about not my family. The police chief and the coroner were involved, and it was very hush-hush. They made it clear this was not to get out to the public. This is where I have to apologize, probably for an anticlimactic ending to this ordeal. I don't know what Not Me and my family were, neither do they. The only thing we know is that they were sentient creatures that looked like us and had yellow blood. I begged the coroner to tell me about their autopsies, but he said he wasn't allowed to say. He must have felt bad for me, since I received a bouquet of flowers a couple days later. The card inside the envelope read, "We don't know what they are." They have the same organs we do, but in different parts of their body, aside from their brain. But what's red and pink inside us is green and yellow inside them. They're humanoid creatures, but whatever they aren't human. The government thinks they may be extraterrestrial. Destroy this letter ASAP. Again, we had our house professionally cleaned. It was almost surely a government team, since they contacted us on behalf of the police. We could not find any Google reviews or website for the company online. My wife and I are not going to go back to our house. We would love to burn it down, but there's no way to do that and avoid suspicion of arson at this point. We'll end up taking a huge loss on the property, since everyone in our neighborhood knows there was an incident involving multiple deaths in the house, but don't know what actually happened. It'll be hard to sell, but eventually it will. We're going to move on from here. I told everyone at work it was a home invasion, and they bought it. I'll go back to work in a couple weeks, and we'll start looking for a new house. Again, I'm sorry. I know everyone wanted a concrete ending and to know exactly what the fuck those things were, but we just don't know. Alien sounds good to me. I've been thinking if they were supernatural or actual demons, gunfire wouldn't have been able to kill them. It's just hard to say. If they were aliens, why did they just sit there and creep in our house for a week? They didn't even try to take over our lives. Art, it's hard to wrap my head around. If it is aliens, keep your eyes peeled out there. There could be more of them. Dad, I saw a zombie. I was in the kitchen making tea when my little girl came rushing in. She ran through the back door so fast, she almost tripped up the step. I poured boiling water from the kettle into a mug, hardly looking up. "Oh yeah?" she said. "Yeah, I did." Its face was all pale and messed up. "It was gross, Dad." I put the kettle back and picked up the milk, sighed inwardly. I really had to be more careful about what I watched on TV in the evening. Rosie has a habit of sneaking downstairs in the night, and last week she caught me watching The Walking Dead, of all things. She's had zombies on the brain ever since. I keep telling her they're not real, but it doesn't seem to make a difference. "Sweetheart, what did we say about zombies?" I scooped the tea bag out of the mug and dumped it in the bin. "You know, if you keep talking about them, Daddy's going to get in trouble with Mommy again." "Yeah, but I saw one." "I know, darling. But I already checked the back garden twice yesterday, and I can promise you it's a zombie-free zone. No, not in the back garden. Egestation. I didn't see it in the back garden." I had the mug half raised to my lips, but now I put it down again. I turned to look at Rosie. Her hair was windswept, and her little cheeks were red, as if she'd been running. "Sweetheart," I put on my best stern dad's not happy voice. "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to be honest with me. Have you been playing along the path out back again?" I didn't really need to ask the question, because I already knew the answer. Rosie is allowed to play in the garden on her own, and sometimes, if she asks us permission first, we let her ride her bike along the path at the back of our house, the one that runs past all the neighbors' back gardens. But that's all we allow her to do. This area is pretty safe, but these days you can never be too careful. There was a burglary a couple of roads over a few months back, and last year someone was mugged on the high street. Several years ago, a few towns over, a little boy even went missing. That was quite a long way away from here, of course, but it made national news for a few days until the search fizzled out. And it made a lot of parents more cautious, because she's getting older now, and she's an adventurous girl, but still, you have to have boundaries. And on a few occasions lately, Rosie's been crossing those boundaries, riding her bike further than she should, not coming in straight away when we call her, sneaking out the back gate when she's only meant to be playing in the garden. As I watch Rosie now, I noticed her face growing redder. She looked away from me, down at the kitchen floor, and scuffed her feet. "Dad, I only went a little way down," she said. "I promise. I was chatting to Mr. Henderson because I saw him in his back garden. I said hello and made him jump." I sighed, so there it was. And Mr. Henderson was Rosie's zombie. Yesterday it was the postman, and the day before that it was a different neighbor. I took a sip of tea and shook my head. Mr. Henderson was, in fairness, a better candidate than the others. You know, the guy lives on his own, and he looks about 100 years old. Moles all over his face, skin like a deflated balloon. Whenever we chatted over the garden fence before, though, he'd always seemed nice enough, just a bit lonely. I couldn't have Rosie going round calling him a zombie. "Listen to me, sweetheart. I know you didn't go far or anything, but I don't want you." I came right back after two. "Dad," Rosie interrupted. She was staring up at me now, blue eyes large and pleading. "I promise, and I even said no when Mr. Henderson offered me an ice cream, because I know you don't like me taking stuff from strangers." I opened my mouth to respond, then paused. "He offered you ice cream?" "Yeah, but I said no. Mr. Henderson really wanted me to come in and have one. But I told him I had to get home. And then I came straight back here to tell you I'd seen a zombie," and Rosie was babbling now, her voice whirring like a motor. But I'd stopped listening. My mind was still stuck on something she had said a moment before. Mr. Henderson really wanted me to come in and have one, and took another sip of tea and frowned. That wasn't good. I didn't mind the neighbors chatting to my little girl, but I didn't like the thought of them inviting her in, not without us there. Not even if they were just kind, lonely old men. I made up my mind to go around and visit Mr. Henderson later, and to tell him that myself. Kindly, of course, but firmly. In the end, though, I didn't get a chance, because a few moments after I'd had the thought, Rosie said something else, something that pushed everything else from my mind, and ended any idea I might have had about going over to Mr. Henderson's house. She said something that made me feel cold. "Daddy, please don't stop me playing in the garden. I promise I won't sneak out again. I don't want the zombie to get me." "Rosie, I'm not going to stop you playing in the garden, but you have to make me a couple of promises too. First, promise me you'll stop going around calling people zombies. Mr. Henderson might be ill, but he's not one of the living dead." Rosie frowned. "I didn't." "What do you mean you didn't? You just ran in here a moment ago calling him one." "No, I didn't. Mr. Henderson's not a zombie. I saw the zombie in his house, but it wasn't him." I frowned. I had the mug raised to my lips to take another sip of tea, but now I put it down again. "What do you mean, sweetheart? You saw someone else in his house?" "Yeah, the zombie, Dad. I could see it pressed against his little basement window while I was talking to him. Cold fingers ran up my spine. What? Yeah, it was really scary. Its face was all bashed up and bloody, and its mouth was open, like it was screaming at me. But do you know what confused me most, Dad? I tried to keep my voice steady. What? Well, I didn't realize kids could be zombies, too. I thought it was only grown-ups. But I guess I must have been wrong because the one in Mr. Henderson's basement looked just like a little boy. My dad always wanted a son. He got 3 daughters instead. He hated us all, hated my twin sisters, hated my mother, but hated me most of all because I was the last child my mother had before she died. That didn't stop him from treating me like his little boy, didn't stop him from attempting to beat the hatred of my own gender into me. Quit your crying. He'd snap, or you'll end up like your sniveling bitch of a mother. After years of that shit, he was shocked that I grew up as a tomboy. I think he hated that even more because I was just a constant reminder of what he never got to have. My mother died when she was only 27, when I was only 4 months. The coroner ruled her death a natural passing, some weird heart complication that took her in her sleep. My dad, though, he says it was because of her family's curse. Whenever it came to him desperate for more information about a mother I never really knew, he never had much to say. I'm convinced he was just drunk since the day she died. Every woman in her damn family, they die when they're 27. He'd sputter in between belches, his breath reeking of stale beer. I think the real curse is that my mom was the one to die, and not him. I wasn't fully convinced by the ramblings of a perpetually drunk man. But when I lost both of my sisters just months before their 28th birthday, I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. Mara was found murdered, her face practically blasted off by a shooter while she was on a jog. Joy took her own life only days later. I was the one who found her, hanging in the bedroom of her apartment as I came to pick her up for Mara's funeral. She'd been there, swinging from the rafters all night. It's hard to live a normal life when you know you have an expiration date, especially when it encompasses an entire year. I always dreaded my birthday, which from an early age became associated less with fun and birthday cake and more with worry and funeral caskets. But once Maura and Joy died, my next birthday, 25, was the most dreadful day of my life. 26 was worse, 27 unimaginable. This is it, I thought as I closed all of the blinds in my apartment, downing the last drop of vodka in the bottle. This is the last year of my life. 27 has been uneventful, to say the least. Why would I make any long-term plans, forge any meaningful relationships when I know they simply cannot last? The worst part of this last year has been simply not knowing when my impending death is coming. It could have been any day within the last 364. It could be within the next minute. I must admit, I became something of a recluse. My windows always shuttered, additional locks installed in my door, letting the phone ring through to voicemail, hiding under my covers with the lights out whenever I got a knock on my door. I stocked up on preserved foods and various goods that I would need to last the year. I was so paranoid that I even covered my mail slot, stuffed a towel in the space beneath my front door. I didn't want anything getting through from the outside world. God forbid an anthrax letter falling off the face of the earth didn't matter much anyway. I didn't have friends or family anymore. My mother and both of my sisters were dead, and my dad disowned me when I came out as a lesbian after my sisters died. Captain Dewingus, I moved away and severed contact soon after. The night before my 27th birthday, I started getting these strange phone calls from a blocked number. I've always had anxiety about phone calls, so I just let it ring. The number kept calling at least once per day throughout the past year. Then the knocking started, once a week at first, but it's only been getting worse, more frequent, and the pounding on my door more frantic each time. Convinced it had something to do with my inevitable death, I've been driven mad by the unknown visitor, especially over the past week. I got ready for bed last night, knowing that tomorrow, today now, is the day I will turn 28. My time had run out, and I searched for comfort in a bottle of liquor. I didn't find it. I fell into bed, drunk and delirious, and prayed the morning wouldn't come, though I knew it would. I eventually got to sleep, but it was restless and unsatisfying. The kind of sleep where you feel like you have one eye open, always watching. That's why I was quick to wake when the door to my bedroom creaked open early in the morning before the first silent light. I sat up in my bed, glancing around my room in a frenzied panic, at first seeing nothing out of the ordinary other than the door, pushed slightly ajar. A closer look revealed something I'd missed, something that sent my heart racing, froze me to my core. 2 dark figures stood in the empty space behind the half-open door, unmoving, almost like a pair of statues, waiting, watching, wordless. Leave me alone, I squeaked, unable to move. Paralyzed in the power of their presence, the shadowy figures instead shuffled out from behind the door, creeping slowly towards me in the dark. I knew this would certainly be the end of my life, the fulfillment of my curse if I didn't act, suddenly recalling the self-defense methods I drilled into my mind. I flipped my bedside lamp on to stun the intruders and reached underneath the table to pull the knife I duct taped there a year ago. A 27th birthday gift to myself. As soon as the light flooded the room, though, I knew the blade would be of no use. My intruders were not a pair of assassins, not human ones at least. In the yellow light of the lamp, I discerned the identities of the dark figures. They were my sisters. Joy stood at the foot of my bed, pale. In that same conservative black dress, I'd found her dead years ago. The one she'd picked out for Moira's funeral, her head hung parallel to her shoulders, neck grotesquely bent from her hanging. Moira was a few steps behind her. I could only assume it was her, considering the severity of her injuries. She'd suffered a gunshot wound to the head, so brutal that we were not allowed to see her after her death, so intense that it had entirely disfigured her face. The lower half of her face had been reduced to a pit of gore, her jawbone barely attached on one side, her mouth mangled with only several teeth remaining studded randomly throughout the mess. Disjekui, why are you here? I cried, gathering my knees to my chest and holding them tight. Are you here to take me? Joy made a feeble attempt to shake her head, the side of her face only brushing weakly against her shoulder. She waited several moments before putting one of her feet in front of the other, moving towards the side of my bed. As I recoiled instinctively, she slowed her pace. Mara trailed after her until they were both beside me. I whimpered as Joy leaned over me, her head flopping forward suddenly with the motion, neck cracking sickeningly. With her lips brushing against my ear, she whispered She tried. Her speech was labored and wheezing, as if her vocal cords had nearly been shredded. What do you mean, Joy? I pleaded. Her lips moved against my ear once more. But no sounds came out despite a clear, strenuous effort. Mar wagered an attempt at answering my query, but only succeeded in sputtering blood from the gaping wound in her face, ejecting one of her remaining teeth onto the floor as her jawbone swung precariously, barely hanging on. She raised one hand, slowly curling it into a fist, before striking her knuckles furiously against my bedpost. The incessant sound startling me. I pushed my eyes shut tight and pulled my knees even closer against my chest. Moira's knocking seemed only to escalate in volume, seemed to go on forever until finally stopped. I cracked my eyes open to find that both of my sisters had vanished, that the light of early morning had begun to spill in through the slats of my blinds. It was just past 6 o'clock, the 7th of June, the day of my 28th birthday, 26 a.m. Once I learned of the curse, I burned the time of my ultimate expiration into my mind. I only had 3 hours and 16 minutes left to live, if I even had that long. Draping my covers over my head, I resolved to spend the rest of my life asleep. First, I figured I'd rather pass peacefully in my sleep like my mother did, than to suffer a fate similar to my sister's. My plans were interrupted, however, by that damn knocking on the door. The interruption usually didn't come so early in the morning. I decided initially to ignore the strange visitor, but pulled the blankets back down soon after as a certain sense of familiarity struck. The pounding on the door reminded me all too much of Moira's knocking just moments before. Easily could have been a trick of the curse, but something compelled me to approach the door. What do you want? I called from behind the barrier, clinging to the relative safety it provided. The reply came from an unfamiliar man's voice. I just have a letter for you, miss. Just slide it under the door and please leave. I returned, using my bare foot to remove the towel I used to block the small space beneath it. He deposited a bright yellow envelope under the door as I requested. I waited quietly for the sounds of receding footsteps before sliding on a pair of gloves to handle the letter. It was addressed to me simply by first name and with no address. Carefully, I unsealed the envelope to reveal a birthday card. I hadn't received one in years. Bright, sparkling letters on the front formed the words, "Daughter, you're 27. I scoffed at the sick joke. I hadn't received a birthday card since I was a child, and my dad couldn't even get my birthday right. I didn't think he even knew my address. I cracked it open gingerly to read the message inside. Laura, if you're reading this, your father has killed me. Don't believe a thing here the police say. I was not the target of a random attack. I did not die of natural causes, and I certainly did not commit suicide. I would never leave you if I had the choice. The truth is, I died is because I found the truth behind my family's curse and foolishly told your father. He was in on it the whole time, planted in my life by some secret society to eradicate me, to eradicate us. This for what we have is not a curse. It is a gift of immense power. The power to heal, but the power to harm just the same. We come into our power at the age of 28, a number associated with independence, leadership, and self-sufficiency, an age where we can handle the responsibilities such a power inevitably comes with. It's a strong number, and you will come into great strength. Though you've always been a strong girl, I hope you've made it this far, but at the same time, I know you have. You were always a feisty little girl for the 4 years I had the pleasure of knowing you, of loving you. You never let anyone tell you what to think or do, especially not your father. Happy birthday. I love you. Mom, I closed the card softly, thinking on the strained words of my sister. Mama tried to warn them, but they didn't listen. The pieces of the puzzle slid into place. My dad must have murdered Mara, and Joy ended her own life out of grief and a belief that she would inevitably be next. At the time of writing this, I only have 2 hours and 32 minutes until I officially turn 28. Over the past hour or so, I've already begun to feel the power flowing into my body, electrifying as it runs through my veins. I will the towel to reposition itself under the door, and it does so, sliding across the floor on its own, intending to keep myself safe until 9:26 after all. I'm planning on surprising my father with a visit for my birthday. Last Sunday at 05 p. to 6 a.m. I turned 28. I suppose that sounds pretty uneventful on its own, but I'd grown up my whole life believing that I was cursed to die at 27 like the rest of the women in my family. It turns out that the curse was just a way to cover up the truth of at 28, I would develop extraordinary powers. My father had killed my mother and at least one of my sisters. Now, I was planning on leaving my story there. But I guess I underestimated just how hungry y'all are for a revenge tale. Gentlemen, I wish I could say that what I'm about to tell you is just that. A simple tale of revenge, perfectly executed. A gaping generational wound neatly closed with a few stitches. Having been lied to all of my life, I value honesty. If that's what you are looking for, I suggest you stop reading now because an entirely new source of terror has come to light. After reading my birthday card last Sunday, I waited anxiously for the clock to hit 9:26. I've been feeling the power start to trickle into me early in the morning. But once the second hand made its full lap around to move the minute hand to the tick, just after the 5, a jolt of energy passed through my body. It was almost painful, like how I imagine being struck by lightning might feel. But at the same time, it felt important, powerful, strong. So strong that it even scared me. As I eagerly accepted the full extent of my powers, I found myself in what I can only describe as a vision. An alternate setting that materialized all around me at once. Logically, I knew that I was still in my living room with my feet planted on the familiar wood flooring. But the ground beneath me felt rough, uneven, gritty. I glanced down to find myself standing upon a shelf of sandy rock, just steps from the edge of some great clear rendered me mute at the top of that cliff. And I swear I could feel the wind whipping all around me, hear the waves crashing furiously below, feel the briny ocean water misting my face. I leaned forward, peering precariously over the edge at the churning sea and its infinite black and white froth. I found its movement. Back and forth, push and pull, comforting in its predictability, until it seemed as if something shifted to upset the flow, something unseen, but its effects impossible to deny. There was something down there, something huge enough to alter the tides, yet hidden beneath the waves. More horrifying still was the palpable feeling that something wanted me to jump, to dive headfirst into the dark sea below. I felt a presence beneath the waters, something ancient, unseen, vastly more powerful than I could ever hope to be. And whatever it was, it wanted me to jump. But it didn't have to force me. It had all the time in the world and it could wait. Vision fell apart as quickly as it had materialized, my comfortable reality reconstructing itself in new and mere seconds. I frantically shook my head to ask the troubling image, to rid myself of the powerful draw it had had on me. I had a job to do. But first, I had to figure out exactly what I could do. I knew I could move things simply by willing it to happen with my mind. But I was startled by the sudden ease of it. Focusing on a glass of water on the table, I attempted to move it just slightly to the left, but it instead flew off the surface, shattering as it hit the wall. I rushed to clean up the mess, plucking shards of glass from the carpet, groaning at the wet spot. To my surprise, once I glanced down at the dampened carpet, droplets of liquid started to rise from the floor until the spot had vanished, the condensation suspended in midair. It's hard to explain, but I just moved it, until I finally released to deposit the water in the sink. I said, before you say anything, I know, it was stupid to test this out on something so fragile. But my powers didn't exactly come with an instruction pamphlet. Dull-like was I through, in my heart I realized I should have been learning this with my mother. And I longed for her more than I had in years. Like a young child, desperately reaching up with outstretched arms, I wanted my mommy. I couldn't help but think of the fear I felt the first time I got my period. It sounds silly, but I was bleeding and I thought I was dying. simply because I didn't have my mom there to explain it to me. My dad couldn't be bothered to parent his child. My dad, the thought of him came with an overwhelming rage. With my senses alive in a way they'd never been before, I felt every cell in my body teeming with kinetic energy until the light bulb in the lamp beside me burst. I hesitated as I pondered the vision, but none of that was important just then. Then, it was time I paid my old man a visit. Though he could never repay me for the losses I'd endured, I intended to collect the one thing that would come close, his miserable life. I started for my room to pack a small bag, but before I knew what had happened, I'd slammed headfirst into my bedroom door. Shit, I muttered, rubbing a palm over what would certainly be a bruise forming across my forehead. I figured then that I could move much faster now, that I'd have to be careful. This certainly made preparing for my impromptu trip easier, though. So I was down in the garage much quicker than expected. I slid into my car and slipped my key in the ignition. Very familiar paranoia forced me to hesitate before opening the garage door, but I pushed through it just as I pushed the button to meet the outside world for the first time in a year, wincing as the morning light spilled into the dark room. I guess I forgot just how bright the sun really is. I popped open the glove box to retrieve a pair of sunglasses. I put them on before pulling out of the garage out of the safety I'd clung to for so long. The drive was fairly ordinary, though fear set in as I thought on all of the questions that remained unanswered. Why had my father killed my family? Why lie about some curse? And most unnerving of all, who had delivered the letter? Was it just some trick to get me out of hiding? Was I wandering into a trap? I planned to avoid spiraling deeper into uncertainty, fear, and worry. I spent some time thinking on my past, about my mother's death. Then both of my sisters within days of one another years later. I recalled coming out to my dad soon after that in a desperate plea for acceptance, for love for my one remaining family member. Then I thought on his hateful response, in the traumatizing attack I endured, weeks later that solidified my decision to cut all ties and move away. We hadn't spoken in all of those years, but I was ready to face him. At least, I hoped. Couldn't be sure what awaited me, couldn't be sure at all. I parked on the street across from our old family home 6 hours later, where his old Navy trucks sat in the driveway. I took a moment to collect myself at his front door, tightening my ponytail as I steeled myself for the task at hand. Then I directed my energy into the barrier until it exploded inward, allowing my body to carry me at full speed into the living room where I knew I'd find him. As expected, he was sitting there. What I didn't expect to see was the gun he had pointed at his head. I took hold of it with my mind, flinging it across the room. Laurie stammered, a dumb look on his face. "What the hell are you doing here?" "The hell are you doing, Dad?" I retorted, gesturing to where the gun had fallen with a nod of my head. "How did you find me? Why'd you send the letter?" A very perplexed look crossed his features, one that told me he had no idea what I meant. His lack of knowledge did little to comfort me. Someone had still found me, had drawn me out of hiding. At that moment, I think he realized the situation he'd found himself in, what I intended to do. He started to scramble up from his chair, but I redirected my focus on his body, pressing him back into it. "You don't get to leave, Dad," I said it. He coughed as I increased the pressure on his chest. "For once, you will listen to me." He strained against my influence, but he was stuck, and he knew it. "I know you killed Mom and Mawara, maybe Joy, too. I know you lied about the fucking curse." I started, a flicker of anger surging as I acknowledged the harsh truth aloud. But the question I can't stop asking myself is, why? Why wait so long to kill us? Why even have us at all? Hesitating, he glanced frantically around the room for escape. I glared at his hands in his lap, then brought my attention to his thumb, filling it with my energy until the bones within shattered, an ivory shard piercing through his flesh. As I moved my stare to his index finger, he wailed in agony, interjecting, "No, don't. No, okay, shit." He took a deep breath as blood spurted from his maimed appendage. I was supposed to have a son. When your mother failed to provide one, I was told to kill her off, to wait to see if you or your sisters could have a son. I just did as I was told. Ours, a cowardly response from a cowardly man. "Who told you?" I pressed, pulling his index finger back slowly, waiting. He didn't respond until after I'd snapped a digit at the knuckle. "Tea, please," he begged, tears running down his wrinkled face. He looked at his mangled hand, horrified as his middle finger began to lift next. Some sort of cult. They breed the women in your family. The women are killed under the curse, and their sons quietly taken away. I don't know what they want with them, but they said all I had to do was give them a son, then kill your mother, your sisters, you, and I'd be set for life. But you and your sisters, you bitches, you weren't having any children. Especially not you when you told me that you'd gone against God. I realized that you'd never have any kids, that you were the only one left, so I took measures in my own hands. And with that admission, I crumpled his entire hand into itself, his splintered bones jutting out at all angles. You don't mean... I breathed, my voice cracking. Despite my efforts not to give him the satisfaction of having hurt me, he groaned in pain before returning with a low, guttural laugh. You didn't think that attack was random, did you? He asked, wheezing. Harsh memories of the brutal invasion forced upon me. The assault I'd endured resurfaced all at once, suddenly taking on a new meaning. As I understood my father's part in my trauma, that he'd sent my attacker, both my focus and my hold on him broke. He leapt up surprisingly quick on his feet after years of sedentary alcoholism. I attempted to will him back to his original position, but I couldn't. I felt like a little girl once more, cowering by the stairs her daddy's shadow loomed closer. I was weak, powerless, again in the face of my father, a man who'd done nothing but hurt me. A man who'd ruined my life in more ways than I could have possibly known. I tore after him through the kitchen and down the hallway until I finally cornered him, taking hold of him and slamming him into a wall. A salty odor perfumed the air as a wind swept through. Did it make you feel like a big fucking man to take everything from me? To kill my mother? To take my sisters away? I screeched in an unearthly bellow. An incomprehensible power flowed in and out of me. I watched, frozen, as the bones of his feet crushed all at once. He howled as the crunching progressed up his lower legs, knees popping, then further still. By the time his thigh bones snapped in a gruesome compound fracture, his mouth just hung open. Did it make you feel strong today? All right, and despite the magnitude of power coursing through me, I fell silent, unable to complete the sentence, unable to say it aloud. Your own fucking child, Dad. I took a deep, calming breath before willing the flesh of his face in alternate directions. A fissure formed first in the center of his forehead, then splintered down the bridge of his nose, ripping his face in two. You little plan worked, though. Dad, I did get pregnant. I got rid of it, of course. I teased, leaning forward to add in a whisper. I wonder if it was a boy. He opened his mouth to fight back, but I was done listening. Do they know I'm alive? I demanded, widening the growing wound until the two sides had separated completely. They didn't, he sputtered, blood dribbling out of his lying mouth. But they sure as shit will now, and they were on their way already. He was right. It wasn't wise to stick around. I pulled my knife from my back pocket, positioning the blade at one side of his neck before dragging it across his throat until I'd sliced him ear to ear. I could have killed him with my newfound powers. But this was something I wanted to do by hand. The relief it brought was short-lived. I returned to my car and immediately set a course back for home. I needed answers, and I needed them yesterday. I could no longer ignore the power of the illusion I'd experienced that morning. I'm hesitant to admit it even now, but I found myself back there on that cliff again in my father's house. The clamor of the waves pounding against rock drew me in, forcing me to step to the very edge, forcing me to stare into the sea far below. A feeling of unbridled hatred extended itself to me there. That time, I didn't attempt to rid myself of the strange vision. That time, I welcomed it, and I lost myself for a moment, surging with uncontrollable power, a mere spectator as his lower half was maimed. More than that, I said I wouldn't lie to you, and I won't. But I did lie to my father. I didn't get rid of my child in the way I'd insinuated. Part of me wanted to prove that I could be a better parent than he was, but I knew I couldn't. So I gave him away. I sped down the highway home infinitely more terrified than when I'd left. I needed to find the source of the letter. I needed to figure out what the hell the visions meant. I needed to know if I'd unwittingly opened myself to something sinister. More importantly, I needed to know that my child was safe from the cult that so desperately wanted him. I need to find my son. After my late father revealed a cult was breeding the women of my bloodline for sons, I was terrified for my own child. As I made the long drive back home, speeding far over the limit yet, somehow not quickly enough, questions plagued my mind. What could they possibly want with him? Had they already found him? What would they do to him, or what had they already done? They had already orchestrated the murder of my sisters, my mother. I wouldn't put it past them to harm him, or me, now that they'd surely found the mangled body I'd left behind. Now, I didn't mention my son straight away because I don't think I have the right to call myself his mother. I gave birth to him almost 4 years ago, but I certainly had no part in raising him. Never expected to get pregnant in my life. And I certainly never expected to keep a pregnancy that was conceived through an assault. But part of me wanted to prove I could be a better parent than my father was. The months leading up to his birth, though, I knew I couldn't be that for him. I was terrified I would end up like my father, and it felt selfish to put my child through the same grief of losing a mother so young. Back then, I thought I still had an expiration date. I gave him up to a couple who couldn't conceive on their own. They were overjoyed to take him. I didn't want to hang around and confuse him, but his new parents agreed to maintain contact in case of medical emergency. He clung to this glimmer of hope on the trip home, knowing that as soon as I got back, all I needed to do was find their contact information. It didn't take long. Minutes after pulling into my garage, I was already dialing their number. I whispered soft pleas into the receiver as I waited for their answer. It was late by then, but this could not wait until morning. Mine had almost rung through to voicemail when a confused woman answered with a groggy greeting. Immediately, words spilled from my mouth like vomit, jumbled and rushed. I wasn't about to tell her what happened that day, so I just told her I'd had a bad feeling about her. Her long, exhausted sigh and hesitance to answer sent my heart racing. When she finally spoke, my blood ran cold. She offered an apology, saying that he'd been placed with another family a year prior due to unexpected behavioral issues. Mainly, he had a knack for breaking things, no matter how closely they watched him. She attempted to reassure me by insisting she'd gone through an agency that actively sought out problem children, that he'd been placed with a family more up to the challenge. She couldn't provide much information on his new family, but she knew that he was still in state. Her answers were infuriatingly vague and non-committal. I knew I wouldn't get much more from her, so I hung up the phone after she agreed to forward me whatever information she had on the adoption and the name of the agency. A simple Google search made it clear that it wasn't even a real organization in the first place. I spent the next few hours agonizing over the whereabouts of my son, leaving frantic messages at any agency I could find. Though I knew they wouldn't hear them until morning, I tried to tell myself that perhaps the agency had just been renamed, but it seemed unlikely. I was left distraught and terrified for my child. Part of me just knew that the cult already had him. It took over a week of sleuthing, but I'm ecstatic to say that I did indeed find the location of my son with the meager information provided. He was still in state, but I live in a pretty large state, so another long journey. I made contact with his new mother, who agreed to a visit just so I could check up on him. I thought maybe she understood the whole mother's intuition thing. I packed my things and piled into my car, setting off immediately. Only about 20 minutes and did I start to entertain the idea that this was most certainly a trap. I'd had a bad feeling about going to my dad's, but I had the element of surprise on my side then, and that was certainly gone now. Pure terror circulated through my system that whole drive, my hands jittering and barely able to grip the wheel. In the late afternoon, I arrived at a beautiful house. One of those houses that seems too good to be true. One of those houses that you know is just a facade for familial dysfunction. I know because I used to live in one of those. As I pulled up, I took a moment to ready myself in the car, as if I was waiting in the wings, rehearsing my lines one more time before going on stage. As I looked out, I swear for a moment I could see a figure in the window, something pale watching. My blood ran cold. It didn't seem to move when I saw it. Instead, cocked its head slightly, curious. Nervously, I exited the car, knocked on the door. A gaunt young woman in a white summer dress cracked it open. "Oh, hi, I'm Laura," she squeaked, visibly flustered. She raked a hand of bony fingers through her stringy brown hair as she pulled the door wide open. "I'm Catherine, come on in." Tentatively, I trudged into the mansion on the thick soles of my combat boots, suddenly aware of how clunky I appeared in comparison to her. Light on her bare feet, she was as dainty and delicate as a daisy. Yet a hollow look in her eye made her seem She led me to an immaculate kitchen, offered me a seat. "Sorry to bother you like this," I began awkwardly, clearing my throat. Where is he?" "Oh, he's upstairs," she replied, wandering about the room to fix a couple glasses of water. "Playing with Lucia as his sister." Cool, I answered, trailing off. Studying her features, I internally remarked at how similar we were in appearance despite our clear differences in mannerisms. Something seemed so familiar about her. When she turned her back to me to open a cupboard, it all became clear. A cluster of freckles on the back of her left shoulder. One that I'd always insisted gleefully looked just like the constellation Virgo. "Katie," I breathed. She turned to face me. A brief moment of clarity flickered behind her sunken eyes before ultimately vanishing. "Catherine." "Katie," I pleaded. "It's me, your cousin, L.A. I know we haven't seen each other since we were little, but if you're trapped, I can help you. Please come with me." Drawing a sharp breath in, she responded almost as if recited. "As a daughter of the precipice, it is my destiny, my honor, my place in the order to be sacrificed." Before I had a chance to respond, she was already screeching at the top of her lungs. "Help! Craig, focusing on her body. I pushed her into the wall to hold her still, but the damage had already been done. I could hear hurried footsteps plodding down the stairs. An elderly man suddenly emerged in the doorway. Despite the unhinged expression across his face, I immediately recognized him from the old family photos I pored over in my youth. Trying to get to know my mother, to get closer to her. Fuck's sake, I sighed. A hapless attempt to disguise my fear as I recognized him as my grandfather, as my mother's father. I took hold of him immediately, freezing him in place, yet found it difficult to maintain my attention on two living beings with free will at once. My grip wavered between the two until I was able to maintain a consistent, albeit weaker, hold on both of them. But my focus deteriorated entirely when a young boy crept out from behind my grandfather's frame. A pale young boy with chestnut hair and bright hazel eyes full of curiosity. A young boy who appeared nearly identical to my own self at his age, because he was mine. Do it now, my grandfather demanded, gesturing wildly in my direction. The child hesitated a moment before nodding mutely. He gave me a firm look that I immediately recognized, the one I'd used frequently since acquiring my powers. I braced myself for the impact, but nothing more than a slight vibration overcame me. A weakened version of my own abilities, I assumed, taking care to avoid the young boy. I returned my stare to my grandfather's body to gather him up in my hold once more. My heart almost stopped as I struggled to make contact with his form, as I realized I didn't have any power at all. I just looked like some stupid asshole glaring at an old man expecting something to happen. Thierry's reaction was one of shock too, but with an undertone of awe. I knew it. He stammered, gazing at my sudden paralysis of power. His initial joy escalating into uproarious laughter. It's been you all along. Prophecy, Catherine mused, pacing across the kitchen to get a closer look. The one who will put an end to the daughters. She called out to Lucia before kneeling on the tile floor before the boy. Laying her forehead on the cool surface, a young girl, perhaps a year older than my son with near white blonde hair, popped in and followed suit. The whole charade made me sick. You mean to wipe us all out? I sneered, using anger as a front for my clear powerlessness. Your own family. He nodded his head contentedly in return, as it has been foretold. The daughters of the precipice are a danger to this world. Too unruly, too unyielding, too powerful. Generations have passed down the promise that one day, one glorious day, a son will be born with the ability to rob the daughters of their abilities, or to weaken them so they may be slain. A wicked grin twisted his features as he ruffled the top of my son's hair. And it was you who delivered him to us. And then, what? You'll just keep killing any girls born in the future. Any girls alive now, I stammered, looking forlornly, fearfully at Lucia. You're telling me you're going to kill that little girl right there, right now? The older man simply raised his eyebrows, as if to communicate that he had no qualms in doing so, as his complete detachment from humanity, from reality, left me trembling. I knew it'd all be over if I didn't act quickly. I gazed softly at the young boy. Hey, what's your name, kid? Kid. That's what I've always called in my mind. Just Kid. He'd often pop into my mind during the most mundane tasks, and I had no name to call him. I wonder what Kid is doing. I wonder if Kid is okay. I wonder if Kid is happy. I wonder if Kid's family loves him. Blinking in confusion, he stuttered, Eli. Eli, okay. I breathed, holding my lips tight together to fight off tears. I didn't want to tell you this way, Eli, but these people do not love you. They're using you to hurt innocent people like me, like Catherine, like Lucia. They killed my mom, my sisters. Please let me go so I can take you somewhere safe. She's a liar, Eli, the elderly man snapped. Raving like an absolute lunatic, he drew an ornate blade from his waistband. We need to put her down. Put them all down like the vermin they are. And his eyes welled over, and I could almost sense the internal battle raging within. Tears finally started to streak his face as the tingling sensation began to ebb. And no, I like my sister. Eli's hold finally broke as he grabbed Lucia by her elbow to flee from the room. I filled the old man with my energy until he was unable to move, as still as a statue, driving my focus into the knife. I snatched it from him to suspend it in midair. I took a deep, calming breath before catapulting it in his direction. The blade was already out of my mental grasp by the time I realized Catherine had launched off of the floor to lunge in front of the man, forcing the weapon buried deep into her neck, taking her to the ground instantly. I scrambled to help her only to realize I'd never healed before, and I certainly did not know how. She swatted my vague attempts away. She pulled the dagger out. I watched in horror as she plunged the blade back into her chest. Gasping, A delighted grin spread across her face in her last moments. An overwhelming surge of anger flared within me, both at my grandfather and at myself for Catherine's demise. I closed my eyes to steady my emotions, but found myself back on that cliff as soon as I opened them, kneeling at its very edge. Slipping wind chapped my face as I gazed at the churning black rapids below. Just beneath the surface, I could get a clearer view of the shadowy mass below, dynamic in its shape, seeming to stretch and move in every direction, shifting constantly, amorphous and vague, yet clearly belonging to one collective intelligence. Chittering whispers arose from below, the individual words indiscernible, yet the message entirely clear. Jump. I furiously shook my head in response to the command, to rid myself of its enticing pull. Reality materialized back around me. A pool of blood had spread beneath me, soaking through the knees of my jeans. As with the crash of the wave subsiding, I could hear a low, guttural moan behind me. I turned to find my grandfather in pieces on the floor, still alive yet clearly in agony. His top half was torn from his legs, which lay motionless across the room. Slick, visceral gore trailed from where he'd been severed, ragged and uneven. First to my feet to finish him off, though I'm afraid to admit I wasn't aware I'd even started in the first place. He whimpered as I followed the trail of blood towards him, but traded cowardice for fury once I crouched beside him. They'll find you, he strained through gritted teeth. His face was pale and covered in sweat, as it has been foretold. Let them, I seethed before sending all of my energy into his neck, snapping it with such force that his head nearly spun, as it has been foretold. My ass. Listen, I hope you all will understand why I've been absent for so long after reading this. I'm now caring for not only my son, but for Lucia as well. I was surprised by their willingness to come with me after I'd slaughtered their previous guardians, but the children had sadly suffered abuse at their hands. It's been an adjustment for sure, but I'm committed to keeping them safe, resolved to protect them as I drove them to their new home, as I knew we'd all be in danger of being found. I just didn't expect it to happen so quickly. As I pulled up to my place, I knew we'd already been found. I knew because a strange man was there, banging on the door. It's been a one hell of a week, friends, and I got a lot to update y'all on. I hope you'll forgive me if I rush through a lot. Like I said, there's a lot I have to say, and I have a job to get back to. Anyway, I believe last time I left off on arriving home from my trip to get my son, I ended up finding him with my shit stain of a grandfather, found out my son is some sort of prophecy, and I came home with not only my son, but with the Lucia, the little girl he's come to know as his sister as well. Of course, I was happy to be reunited with my child, Eli. But I was terrified now that I knew he was so valuable to the cult behind the death of my mother and sisters. So I was understandably pretty freaked out to find a strange man knocking on my front door the minute I got home. "Laura, who's that?" Lucia squeaked from the back seat. I hadn't even realized that I'd stopped in the middle of the street. I swallowed my fear, pulled into the driveway, and stepped out of the car, commanding the kids to stay inside. I locked the doors and approached the stranger. "Excuse me," I barked, attempting to appear confident. I wasn't exactly out of the closet with my powers yet, so I was nervous about what could happen. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The man turned to face me, a grin plastered across his face. "Laura," he replied, almost nostalgically, as if he knew me. I was sure I'd never seen him before, and I think I'd recognize him if I had, considering the raised pink scar across his left cheek. He had the rough, rugged appearance of a man who'd seen too much. "Answer me," I demanded, gaze firmly locked on him. If he made any sudden movements, I had to be ready. He remained where he stood, seemingly attuned to my apprehensions. "It's me, Laura. It's Uncle Job." I couldn't help but laugh at whatever mind games he was attempting as I hardened my stare, freezing him in place. I hadn't seen my Uncle Job since I was little, but my memory wasn't that poor. He was my mother's twin, Blackout. He had the same spattering of freckles across his pale face and light brown hair that she had, that I have. With his olive skin and tight salt and pepper crew cut, the man before me looked nothing like Job, nor anyone in my family. "Let's try that again," I breathed. Inching closer towards the stranger, "Tell me the truth." I could, sense a flicker of fear within him, within me as well. If they'd found me already, I knew I was screwed. But I have to deal with that later. The man was silent for a few long moments, and then he began to sing, all the little girls dancing on the cliff tops, all their little bracelets jingling in the breeze. He started the tune jaunty, strangely familiar. All the little girls, suddenly their dance stops, and all the little girls jumped down into the sea. I finished, eyes welling with tears, an old nursery rhyme I didn't even know I'd retained. One my Uncle Job had taught me while we reenacted the scene with my dolls. I relinquished my hold on him. Why? Why have you come? I'm here to help, L.A. They're after you. Won't be long until they find what they're looking for. He sighed, nodding his head towards the car, towards Eli. I knew I had to keep my guard up. Couldn't trust anyone in the family anymore, but he was always so kind, so gentle, nothing like my father. Something in him seemed genuine. I made a split-second decision to hear him out. I ushered the kids out of the car into the house and allowed Job inside. I was terrified. I'd made the wrong choice, but figured I'd at least be able to use the full extent of my powers if I needed to behind closed doors. I think Job knew it too. After getting the children settled in my room for a nap, I sat Job down on the couch in the living area. I got him a glass of water, though. I never let him out of my direct line of sight. It wasn't just me I had to worry about anymore. Tell me everything. I rushed, pulling a chair to face him. I know you have no reason to trust me, he answered, a deep frown on his weathered face. I wouldn't trust me either, but you have to understand, my father raised me to believe that the women of our family are evil. He raised me to believe in the prophecy, inhaling sharply through my teeth. I cut him off. Yeah, he told me about that. Before I killed him. Job nodded almost enthusiastically, his eyes widening. Good riddance. He wanted me to fulfill the prophecy so badly, but when I didn't grow to display any powers, he appointed me as your mother's monitor. The name itself struck fear into my heart. Who had been monitoring me as your mother's monitor, I was to take an active role in her life, to keep tabs on her, to make sure she didn't escape before she turned 28. Despite the remorse evident in his tone, both terror and anger surged within me. Who is my monitor? I asked reluctantly. Your father, Shite. Killed him too, I blurted, if only to settle my own nerves. Job smirked. I probably would have been your monitor too, but I defected from the cult soon after you girls were born. Your mom was a fighter, so they made sure I kept a close eye on her. Ironically, spending so much time with her forced me to critically examine the ideologies my father had instilled in me until they started to unravel. When I got to know you and Joy and more, I finally saw the truth. I couldn't comprehend the possibility of evil within you girls, knew it couldn't be right to snuff out the light you brought to the world. I started digging, found out some hard truths. First turns out I was being monitored too. He stated with a sad laugh, tears pooling in his eyes. I managed to warn your mother about the cult, the fathers of the precipice, before they removed me. Before I shook my head vigorously, fearfully reminding myself that this could easily be a setup. Besides, there was still the matter of his appearance to clear up. How can I trust you? You don't even look like yourself. Today, when your mother was murdered, I lost my best friend. I wanted nothing more than to dismantle the fathers, but I knew they were looking for me. I scoured the internet for solutions. After years in hiding, I found just that in a strange boutique, one where you can walk out in an entirely new appearance, he explained, gesturing to the new features he'd been granted. I don't expect you to trust me. Your sisters didn't because they didn't recognize me. But I know you are my only chance at ending the father's cycle of killing now. Qualitatively, I allowed myself to put my trust in him. I elected to keep Eli's power secret, terrified of what might happen if the man I'd let into our lives turned out to be just as bad as other family members I'd been reunited with recently. I was constantly on edge, felt as if I had to sleep with one eye open again. That kind of paranoia is all too familiar to me, like the curse I believed would take me all of my life was renewed. But this time I knew the danger to my life, to Eli and Lucia's lives, to be real. As I got the children accustomed to their new home, Job spent the next weeks attempting to infiltrate the fathers of the precipice to discern the location of their headquarters. He insisted that many young boys were held captive there, guarded by the fathers. He painted a horrifying picture of the abuse he'd suffered there, the indoctrination forced upon him. He split between strategizing with Job and playing with the children. I spent long hours training myself and bolstering my discipline. After I put the kids to bed one evening, I found myself plagued by guilt, recalling how Catherine had died at my hands, how I couldn't heal her. I chased the memory with 6 shots of vodka and spent the rest of the night alternating between dragging a razor across my skin and willing the wounds shut to put my mind at ease. I must admit that, despite the powers I had at my disposal, I feared going up against so many people hell-bent against my survival. It was hard enough trying to control 2 people last time. I was terrified how I would fare against the dozens of men Job approximated would be waiting for me. But I knew I had to try, if what he said was indeed true. So when Job shot out of his seat last week, I immediately knew that he'd found what he was looking for. He'd been perched on that chair in front of his computer so long that I thought he might have grown attached to it. My uneasiness escalated to new heights as I understood he'd found the place where I'd meet my fate. whether good or bad. He called me over to show me his screen. He typed in the address to show an image of my destination, a sprawling green lawn out front, a towering white mansion. It was almost a day's drive away, but it was within reach, parents suggested. And although I was scared out of my mind of what might await me there, I wanted to go. I needed to finish what I'd started. Bob and I made arrangements to leave the next morning, though we argued over how to handle the children. I didn't trust anyone to watch them, yet I refused to take them with me. They wanted Eli more than they wanted me, and I knew they wouldn't hesitate to kill Lucia. It seemed like there was no solution. I insisted on going alone, but Job wouldn't hear it. We agreed to settle it in the morning, so I put the kids to bed, while Job laid down to rest on the couch. I slipped out of the house in the middle of the night. It was certainly a risk leaving the children with Job, but I'd come to realize that he was the only person I felt like I could trust. I again feared this was a misstep, but I prayed otherwise. I set a course for the mansion that housed the fathers of the precipice and quietly pulled out of the driveway. I realized that each time I update you all, I mention how terrified I am as I make whatever trip I'm on. This time, though, I felt like I was nearing closer to certain death with each mile covered. I worried constantly about Eli and Lucia and wanted nothing more than to come home to them. So I resolved to do just that. Though it seemed overly optimistic, naive, as I drew closer to my destination, I found myself panicked, jittery. I'd pulled over to nap in my car, but it was a restless sleep. Still, the sooner I was finished with the fathers, the sooner I could return home. I parked about a mile away, opting to walk the remaining distance. The state was even more lavish in person than the pixels on Job's screen could possibly display. I felt dwarfed by its size and feared it as if it were some massive predator. Its enormous arch toward the mouth I was willingly striding towards. This time, though, I wasn't looking for answers, wouldn't be asking any questions. Job had instructed me where I needed to go to rescue the children. I thrust the door open to find a large entryway with 2 marble staircases leading up to an overhang on the second level. A man stood, frozen, on one of the steps. I snapped his neck with no hesitation. The seconds, more men spilled onto the second-floor balcony before clambering down the stairs. One drew a gun, pointing it at my chest. I redirected his aim before forcing him to empty the chamber into his mouth. I forced another off the overhang, slamming him face first into the marble flooring. First we permitted, but they kept coming one after another, closer and closer. I took out a few more by releasing the chandelier from the ceiling to crush them, but as soon as I felt I had the upper hand, more men trickled downstairs, more came at me from the hallways on either side of me. Panicked, overwhelmed, and terrified. I felt a pair of arms seize me from behind, saw the herd of men closing in on me, their faces warped with hatred and disgust. I shoved as many of them away as I could, but I was merely buying time, and I was barely doing that considering how many there were surrounding me. Too many to control on my own. Each attempt grew feebler, weaker as I felt myself fatiguing rapidly. I knew it was over then. Yet as I began to accept my fate, I started to hear the faint sounds of waves breaking against tough rock, of wind whistling all around. My surroundings began to fade, giving way to that same old scene that tormented me since I first received my powers. There was the shelf of rock, the churning black rapids down below, the whipping wind, but there was something else there this time, something that chilled me to the bone. There were girls. Not just little girls, but teenagers and young women too, all in flowing white dresses with gleaming silver adorning their wrists. At first sight, it seemed almost as if they were dancing, in constant movement, moving in pairs, switching partners, all the little girls dancing on the cliff tops. The horrified looks on their faces made it clear, though, that this was not a joyous occasion. They were saying goodbye. Their gowns thrashed about in the wind as they whispered softly to one another, tears streaking their faces. In lieu of embracing, they reached out to hold another's hands in theirs tenderly before moving on to the next. This was all they could do. Their wrists were shackled, all the little girls, bracelets jingling in the breeze. A man's bellow pierced through the tragic scene, startling both me and the group gathered on the cliff. Just behind me, a collection of men began to advance upon the women and girls, brandishing knives in their hands. I leapt back at the sight, but they didn't seem to notice me, only seemed to see or care about the women and girls in white. All the little girls, suddenly their dance stops. They continued forward as the first of the girls jumped. Relentless in their pursuit until, screaming in horror, they all launched themselves off the precipice. And all the little girls jumped down into the sea. I rushed forward to stare over the edge of the cliff, watching in terror as the girls thrashed wildly in the water, drowning. Their collective fear, despair, anger overwhelmed me, the power of their emotions nearly suffocating. Failing, I beat one fist into the rough rock beneath me as, one by one, they tired, their bodies ceasing to sink deep below. I saw envelop them until it appeared to me, just as it had before, the dark, churning rapids. So fearsome, yet at the same time so inviting, there was no time for second guessing. I threw my arms above my head and dove off the cliff and plunged headfirst into the brisk, briny water. As the sea swallowed me whole, I propelled myself deeper, closer to whatever had been coaxing me down all of this time. Forcing my eyes open, I recoiled as I realized I was not alone. Longing for sedation, the fallen girls and women swam in a torrent around me, their corpses now bloated and discolored, flesh peeling and hanging off bone in several places. The original daughters of the precipice forced off the cliff before they could age into their powers, urging myself even further into the dark water. I nearly opened my mouth to gasp as I saw Mora and Joy swimming alongside me. Their gruesome appearances still jarring, though their presence was oddly comforting. Moira extended a finger to point. I followed the trajectory with stinging eyes. All my apprehensions came to a screeching halt as a figure came into view. Pushed near it was my mother, beaming. She reached her hand up from the depths. I extended mine in turn, kicking my feet to hasten the connection. As soon as my hand grazed hers, a surge of electric energy raced through me, startling me. She gave me an encouraging nod, and I clasped onto her hand, holding it tight in my own. Returned to reality at the father's mansion with a splitting screech. The men backed away, hands clapped over their ears. A power unlike any I'd ever known or felt before flowed through me, flowed out of me as I faced each of my attackers with renewed energy. I felt my hand plunge into one man's chest to crush his beating heart still inside him. I felt my energy fill an assailant's brain with so much energy that it overheated to explosion, blood dribbling from his ears as he crumpled to the ground. I felt myself shred 5, 10, 15. More attackers with less energy than it takes to flick on a light switch. This is my attackers taken care of. I took a deep breath in, slowly exhaling the rage and power granted to me by the daughters of the precipice. I needed to be in control when I found the children, though I feared a second wave of fathers likely awaited me. As I quietly padded across the room, I noticed one of my assailants still clinging to life, his eyes wide and breath shallow. Directing my glare at him, I flipped his body over, leaving him face down in a thick pool of his comrade's blood to drown. The thought it seemed fitting. I followed Jab's directions down the hallway to a locked door. Busting the lock with a pointed stare, I crept down the stairs the door revealed, anxious for what might await me. What I saw down there was much worse than I ever anticipated. The room was nearly empty. No children, no people save for one man sitting. Wade just laughed at my shocked expression, my fear for the children. Not what you were expecting. My heart began to race, so it was a trap. Job lied to me, and I'd left my children with him. You're just like all the other daughters. You think you're so smart, think you're better than us. He rambled, shaking his head incredulously. The captain was that we knew you would find us. Knew you'd be stupid enough to come here yourself. We placed all the boys in homes. We couldn't risk you coming here to slaughter them all. The prophecy will be fulfilled as it has been foretold. Here was my turn to laugh, scoffing at his assumption that I'd come to kill innocent children. The prophecy has been fulfilled, all right? I muttered, immobilizing him in my hold. I didn't know what tricks he might have had up his sleeve, so I couldn't be too careful. My son is the prophecy, yet he's stronger, smarter, and more compassionate than any of you. When the moment of truth came, he thought for himself. He let me go. The cycle is over. You're wrong, he spat, glaring. The others are still out there. They will continue to breed and slaughter you like livestock. Believing the prophecy remains unfulfilled, they will find you. They will kill you, and they will take your son. I froze in place as I realized he was right. I thrust his head into the wall behind him before running out of the mansion to get my vehicle. An Astor return trip was no easier than the trip there. I felt as if I had to be on constant surveillance. Worst of all, I had no idea what I was coming home to. The worst-case scenario ran through my mind on repeat. Job had killed Lucia, had taken Eli, had alerted more of the fathers to my location. More likely than not, they would already be there. I was so tired. I didn't have much fight left in me. I should have stopped to sleep, paused to recharge for the attack I knew awaited me. But there was no time to waste if my children were in danger again. The thumping sound coming from my trunk showed me I had even less time than I'd originally hoped. As I finally pulled back into my driveway, the front door swung open. I jumped in my seat, bracing myself for the onslaught I knew I was unprepared for. Instead, Eli ran out, followed by Lucid and Job. I thrust the door to my car open and stumbled out of the vehicle to meet them, crumbling with exhaustion onto the paved ground. Eli wrapped his arms around me, tears running down his face. "D, don't leave again," he cried weakly. I held him close as I finally allowed myself to process all that had happened in the past month, to finally grieve the losses I'd faced, the years of life I'd lost to a false curse, the lives I'd taken. Heaving sobs racked my body as Lucia joined the embrace. I snaked one arm around her shoulders. Uncle Job kneeled on the ground behind me to rub an open palm over my back, comforting me. A series of loud thumps rocked the back of the parked car, sent me back into panic. I whipped my head around to glance at Job over my shoulder. "We're not safe," I whispered. "Get the kids inside." He did as I asked. Once I was alone again, I opened the garage door to pull my car inside. Popping the trunk open, I stared down at my captive, the man from the basement. He was bound and gagged, struggling furiously against his restraints. I rammed his head against the floor of the trunk until he was out cold again. He'd come back for him later. I needed a hot shower and a warm meal, needed some time with my family first. Like I said before, he was right. There are still more out there, still more fathers using the daughters as incubators for prophecy that already come. A prophecy of hatred and fear that I will end with all of the compassion and love I have for my son, all of the humanity that exists within him that the fathers couldn't steal. There are still more fathers who would come to harm my family, still more innocent children in their clutches. The days since I've been using my powers to extract information from my captive, healing him just as he starts to slip away. Job and I have already confirmed 3 homes for me to visit once I've gotten enough rest. Exhausted, physically, mentally, emotionally, and I'm tired of using my powers to harm. But I know I can't stop yet. I know there are more out there like me, more innocent women, more innocent children. Likely more defectors like Job too. I can't rest until I find and free them all, until I ensure the safety of my family. And I will make damn sure that every woman and girl in my family, every daughter of the precipice, makes it to age 28. Samantha told me about it on our 3rd date. We were watching a movie on her couch when I made my move to kiss her. She whipped her hand in front of my face and blocked me. "There's something you need to know," she said. I braced myself. "Here it comes. I'm not ready for a relationship. Nothing to do with you, of course. It was the absolute last thing that I wanted to hear, because I was already crazy about her." "Okay," I said. "I have a removable face." "That's a new one. You have a what now?" I was about to laugh, but she was wearing a deadly serious expression. "I have a removable face. Is that like a metaphor or something?" "No, my face is literally removable." "Look closely." She lifted her chin and traced her jawline with a finger. "You can see the seam." After admiring how beautiful her neck was for a dizzying moment, I leaned in for an inspection. It was very hard to see, but it did look like there was a slightly unnatural transition there from her face to her throat. I grew dizzier as a dozen questions rushed into my brain. "Don't bother asking why or how or anything like that," said Samantha. "I can't tell you that. If that's going to be a problem, you should leave now. I'm letting you know this because I like you and I want to take the next step, but this is non-negotiable." "Okay," I said, unsure of what was happening. "Not a problem. So what? You have a removable face. There's something else. Once a day, usually in the evening, I have to remove the face and disinfect the inside of it. If I don't, it will rot. This takes about an hour, give or take, depending on how my day went. During this time, you must never, ever look at my real face. Never, do you understand?" "Yes, got it. Don't ask about it. Don't look at your real face." Samantha stood up. "Now I'm going to go into the bathroom and clean my face. That will give you plenty of time to think about what I've told you. If you're here when I'm done, that's great. I would like that. But if you're gone," she turned and walked into her bedroom. I sat in stunned silence as I heard the bathroom door close. I gave the thing some serious thought. It was possible that it was a joke of some kind. It was possible that it was a delusion. Was it possible that it was true? Well, it was certainly possible to transform an actor's face with movie makeup, so I supposed it was possible that Samantha wore a removable face every day. Maybe she had had a horrible accident where her flesh had been mangled. Maybe her face had been melted by acid or burned by fire or the skin shorn off by heavy machinery. I would never know because she would never tell me and I would never see it. Where's the things that we tell her? See, I pictured a face of raw, naked muscle rotting away. Could I kiss her if that was what I was kissing? But wasn't that what I was kissing? But wasn't that what we all were in the skin? Just muscle and bone and blood and squishy organs? I paced around the living room, running my hand through my hair. I liked Samantha a lot. She was smart and funny and beautiful. But was that beauty real? Did it count? Did it matter if it was real or not? Was I being superficial even worrying about it? Later, when she came out of the bathroom, I was still there. I looked at her face. She smiled and I was in love. We dated. We moved in together. We decided to get married. For the most part. It was a completely normal relationship, typical of two young people in love, building a life together. During the day, it was easy to forget about the face altogether. It looked natural enough and only in certain positions. In certain lights, was there ever any indication that it wasn't natural? I'm hard to need to play with every night was the same. Samantha would close herself in the bathroom, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for two, and clean the inside of her face. The curiosity never left me. I would sit there and wonder what was under that face. I came so close to barging in on her a few times, but I never did. I did occasionally ask her about it. About what, if anything, had happened. About how it was possible to make the removable face look so real. About what it really looked like underneath. I tried to coax her into showing me, assuring her that I loved her no matter what, and didn't give a damn what a real face looked like. I was just curious, that's all. She never showed me or told me the story behind it. But she didn't get upset at me. Unless I was really badgering her, she'd just shrug and say, "You know you can't see it? You know I can't tell you about it." I never told anybody about Samantha's removable face. It's not that she asked me not to. I just didn't think it was anybody's business. Except once I did tell somebody. It was during my bachelor's party. We had rented several cabins in Big Shore and spent the night drinking and packing our noses with powders that we shouldn't have been packing our noses with. Everyone else had passed out, and the sun was creeping up behind us as I stood on the majestic cliffs with my friend Chris looking down on the Pacific waves crashing against the rocks. Chris was my best friend, as close to a brother as I'd known. We'd grown up together and visited each other at college often and spent the summers together. After college, we'd moved to different cities, but we stayed in close contact, standing there on the cliffs. I told Chris about Samantha's removable face. At first, he thought I was joking. Then he had 1,000 questions, most of which I couldn't answer. What's underneath? I don't know, man. I don't know. Doesn't that drive you crazy, not knowing? I shrugged. Lots of stuff I don't know. Don't know how to do calculus, and I don't know what happens when we die. But dude, she's about to be your wife. And you don't even know what she looks like. I mean, I'd have to take a look, like you could set a camera up in the bathroom. That's where she does it, right? Set up a camera and have a look, and then you'll know. I sighed, yeah, it drives me crazy. I've asked her 1,000,000 times. But she told me I could never look. Gotta respect that, man, even if I don't like it. That's love. Chris laughed, you telling me to respect a woman. Up is down now. Then we fell back into talking about old times as the new day dawned. Chris was in town for business last week and planned on spending the weekend at our house. The conversation at Big Sur had happened 4 years ago, and we hadn't spoken about Samantha's removable face since, despite keeping in close contact and seeing each other as often as two people transforming into adults in different parts of the country can. It happened on Saturday evening. We were lounging lazily in the backyard, deep into the beer, having just finished with some grilled steaks, when I got a text from work. God damn it, I groaned. I have to make a work call. Seriously, said Samantha, raising an artificial eyebrow on a Saturday night. My biggest client, baby. Sorry. It is what it is, I guess, said my wife. I'm going to head inside and get cleaned up. Chris, are you okay just hanging out for a bit? Chris smiled, so I'll be fine. Got my beer, got some weeds to pull in your garden. God knows your lazy ass husband isn't going to do it. Those tomatoes are choking to death. It's a tragedy. Captain Dahlia rolled my eyes and went into the side yard to make my call. 15 minutes into it, I heard the screams coming from inside. Both my best friend and my wife were wailing in terror. I dropped the phone and ran into the house and down the hall to our bedroom. Through the open door, I could see that the door to the master bathroom was also standing open. Don't come in, screamed Samantha. I don't have my face on, call an ambulance. He looked, oh God, he looked. She sounded desperate and truly horrified. That made me desperate and horrified, and I wanted to rush into the bathroom, but I knew suddenly that that would be a mistake. I knew suddenly that Samantha didn't want me to look at her real face, not out of a sense of vanity, but for my own safety. Chris staggered backwards, out of the bathroom. He was holding a straightened-out paperclip, which he had used to pick the privacy lock. Now he was stabbing it again and again into his eyes, shouting gibberish. He was clearly in the depths of madness, and it turned my stomach to see him mutilate himself. Call a fucking ambulance. My wife screamed. Don't come in here. He fucking looked. I turned and ran back to the side yard, where my phone was lying in the newly mowed grass. My client was still on the line, alarmed, asking what was happening, what all the screaming was. I hung up on him and called 911. When the paramedics arrived, Chris was having a seizure in the hallway. Samantha was stroking his head, sobbing. Her face was on, but it had been done hastily and everything looked a little off. My world has been dark this past week. My best friend is in a psychiatric hospital under suicide watch. He's completely blind and mostly catatonic, except when he slips into a violent bobbling mania. Doctors are optimistic that his state is temporary, but they don't know the truth about what caused it. Because I told the paramedics that Chris had taken a large dose of psychedelic mushrooms and fallen in psychosis, I saw no good reason to tell the truth about what had happened. Who would believe that one look at my wife's real face would make somebody insane? At best, we would be the subjects of a long investigation. Was worst, we would have to prove that what we were saying was true by showing somebody Samantha's face. Then the same thing would happen again, and what after that? I had no idea, no interest in finding out. Or for Samantha's part, I knew that she would never consent to show anybody her real face, no matter what the consequences of refusal were. I did get a follow-up call from the police, asking me to confirm my story. The hospital found no traces of psilocybin in Chris's blood, though that's not unheard of since it has a short half-life. If they end up testing his hair, I will likely be in a lot of trouble. But that's truly the least of my concerns. Samantha is in a state of her own. She still cleansed the inside of her face, though not as regularly. And when she puts it back on, it's always crooked now. It's beginning to smell a little bit. I've tried to assure her that it wasn't her fault. He knew, I said. I told him that nobody was ever allowed to look at it. He knew, and then he broke into the bathroom. This is not on you, baby. Please talk to me. Not on me. That one look at my fucking face makes people insane. Please, I just need some time alone. For me, I am doing my best to hold it together. Do you know what's strange, though? Despite what happened to Chris, I still find myself curious about what my wife's real face looks like. More curious than ever, really. I have a pretty good track record for finding missing people. Most of the time, they just wander off the path or slip down a small cliff, and they can't find their way back. The majority of them have heard the old stay where you are staying, and they don't wander far. But I've had 2 cases where that didn't happen. Both bother me a lot, and I use them as motivation to search even harder on the missing persons cases I get called on. First was a little boy who was out berry picking with his parents. He and his sister were together, and both of them went missing around the same time. Their parents lost sight of them for a few seconds, and in that time both the kids apparently wandered off when their parents couldn't find them. They called us, and we came out to search the area. We found the daughter pretty quickly, and when we asked where her brother was, she told us that he'd been taken away by the bear man. She said he gave her berries and told her to stay quiet, that he wanted to play with her brother for a while. Last she saw of her brother, he was riding on the shoulders of the bear man and seemed calm. Of course, our first thought was abduction, but we never found a trace of another human being in that area. The little girl was also insistent that he wasn't a normal man, but that he was tall and covered in hair, like a bear, and that he had a weird face. We searched that area for weeks. It was one of the longest calls I've ever been on, but we never found a single trace of that kid. The other was a young woman who was out hiking with her mom and grandpa. Married to the mother, her daughter had climbed up a tree to get a better view of the forest, and she'd never come back down. They waited at the base of the tree for hours, calling her name before they called for help. Again, we searched everywhere, and we never found a trace of her. I have no idea where she could possibly have gone because neither her mother or grandpa saw her come down. A few times I've been out on my own searching with a canine, and they've tried to lead me straight up cliffs. Not hills, not even rock faces. Straight, sheer cliffs with no possible handholds. It's always baffling. And in those cases, we usually find a person on the other side of the cliff, or miles away from where the canine has led us. I'm sure there's an explanation, but it's sort of strange. One particularly sad case involved the recovery of a body. A 9-year-old girl fell down an embankment and got impaled on a dead tree at the base. It was a complete freak accident, but I'll never forget the sound her mother made when we told her what had happened. She saw the body bag being loaded into the ambulance, and she let out the most haunting, heartbroken wail I've ever heard. It was like her whole life was crashing down around her, and a part of her had died with her daughter. From another SAR officer that she killed herself a few weeks after it happened. She couldn't live with the loss of her daughter. I was teamed up with another SAR officer because we'd received reports of bears in the area. We were looking for a guy who hadn't come home from a climbing trip when he was supposed to, and we ended up having to do some serious climbing to get to where we figured he'd be. We found him trapped in a small crevasse with a broken leg. It was not pleasant. He'd been there for almost 2 days, and his leg was very obviously infected. We were able to get him into a chopper. And I heard from one of the EMTs that the guy was absolutely inconsolable. He kept talking about how he'd been doing fine, and when he'd gotten to the top, a man had been there. He said the guy had no climbing equipment, and he was wearing a parka and ski pants. He walked up to the guy, and when the guy turned around, he said he had no face. It was just blank. He freaked out and ended up trying to get off the mountain too fast, which is why he'd fallen. He said he could hear the guy all night climbing down the mountain and letting out these horrible muffled screams. That story bothered the hell out of me. I'm glad I wasn't there to hear it. One of the scariest things I've ever had happen to me involved the search for a young woman who'd gotten separated from her hiking group. We were out until late at night because the dogs had picked up her scent. So when we found her, she was curled up under a large rotted log. Well, she was missing her shoes and pack, and she was clearly in shock. She didn't have any injuries, and we were able to get her to walk with us back to base ops. Along the way, she kept looking behind us and asking us why that big man with black eyes was following us. We couldn't see anyone, so we just wrote it off as some weird symptom of shock. But the closer we got to base, the more agitated this woman got. She kept asking me to tell him to stop making faces at him. At one point, she stopped and turned around and started yelling into the forest, saying that she wanted him to leave her alone. She wasn't going to go with him, she said, and she wouldn't give us to him. We finally got her to keep moving, but we started hearing these weird noises coming from all around us. It was almost like coughing, but more rhythmic and deeper. It was almost insect-like. I don't really know how else to describe it. And when we're within sight of base ops, the woman turns to me and her eyes are about as wide as I can imagine a human could open them. She touches my shoulder and says to tell you to speed up. He doesn't like looking at the scar on your neck. I have a very small scar on the base of my neck, but it's mostly hidden under my collar. And I have no idea how this woman saw it. Right after she says it, I hear that weird coughing right in my ear, and I just about jumped out of my skin. I hustled her to ops, trying not to show how freaked out I was. But I have to say I was really happy when we left the area that night. This is the last one I'll tell, and it's probably the weirdest story I have. Now, I don't know if this is true in every SAR unit, but in mine, it's sort of an unspoken, regular thing we run into. You can try asking about it with other SAR officers, but even if they know what you're talking about, they probably won't say anything about it. We've been told not to talk about it by our superiors. And at this point, we've all gotten so used to it that it doesn't even seem weird anymore. In just about every case where we're really far into the wilderness, I'm talking 30 or 40 miles. At some point, we'll find a staircase in the middle of the woods. It's almost like if you took the stairs in your house, cut them out, and put them in the forest. I asked about it the first time I saw some, and the other officer just told me not to worry about it, that it was normal. Everyone I asked said the same thing. I wanted to go check them out, but I was told very emphatically that I should never go near any of them. I just sort of ignore them now when I run into them because it happens so frequently. There's been an overwhelming amount of people mentioning the similarity between some of my stories and those of David Pauly's. I assure you, I'm not trying to rip him off in any way. I've got nothing but respect for the guy. He's actually what inspired me to write this because I can verify a lot of the things he talks about. We do have a lot of these strange missing persons cases, and most of the time they aren't solved, either that, or we find them in places they have no business being. I personally haven't been on many calls like that, but I'll share a few that I've seen and a story my friend told me that relates to this. There was a lot of feedback about the stairs, so I'll touch on that briefly here, and I'll also include a story. They come in a variety of shapes, sizes, styles, and conditions. Some are pretty dilapidated, just ruins, but others are brand new that look like they came from a lighthouse. They were metal and spiral, almost old-fashioned. The stairs don't go up infinitely or farther than I can see, but some sets are taller than others. Like I said before, just imagine the stairs in your house, as if someone cut and pasted them in the middle of nowhere. I don't have any pictures. It's never really occurred to me to try again after the first time, and I don't really feel like risking my job over it. I'll try again in the future, but I can't really promise anything. A few people expressed confusion about the guy who ran into the man with no face. Just to clarify, when the climber ascended and reached the top of this peak, he saw another man in a parka and ski pants. This was the man with no face. Sorry about the confusing wording of that story. I'll try to avoid that in the future. All right, on to the news stories. As far as missing persons go, I'd say about half the calls I get are related to that. The others are rescue calls. People who fall down cliffs and hurt themselves. Get injured by fire. You wouldn't believe how often this happens. Mostly drunk kids get bitten or stung by animals or insects. We're a tight team, and we have veterans who are excellent at finding signs of lost people. That's what makes these cases where we never find any trace of them so frustrating. One in particular was upsetting for all of us because we did find a trace of them, but it just led to more questions than answers. An older man had been hiking alone on a well-established trail, but his wife called to say that he hadn't come home when he should have. Apparently, he had a history of seizures, and she was worried that he hadn't taken his medication and had suffered one out on the trail. Before you ask, I have no idea why he thought it was okay to go out alone or why she didn't go with him. I don't ask about that kind of thing because past a certain point, it really doesn't matter. Someone is missing, and it's my job to find them. We went out in a standard search formation, and it wasn't long before one of our vets found signs that the guy had gone off the trail. We grouped up and followed him, spreading out in a fan to make sure we were covering as much ground as possible. Suddenly, a call comes over the radio telling us to all head back to the vet's location. And we come right away because this usually means the missing person is injured and we need a full team to help get them out safely. We meet back up and the vet is just standing at the base of a tree with his hands on the sides of his head. I asked my buddy what's going on, and he points up into the branches of this tree. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing, but there's a walking stick dangling from a branch at least 30 feet off the ground. The little strap thing on the handle has been looped around the branch, and it's just hanging there. There's no way the guy could have tossed it up that far, and we don't see any other signs that he's still in the area. We call up into the tree, but it's obvious no one's in it. We're all just sort of left scratching our heads. We keep searching for the guy, but we never find him. We even bring our connies out, but they lose his scent long before this tree. Eventually, the search is called off because there are other calls we have to attend to, and past a certain point, there's not much we can do. The guy's wife called us every day for months asking if we'd found her husband, and it was heartbreaking to hear her get more and more hopeless each time. I'm not sure why this call in particular was so upsetting, but I think it was just the sheer improbability of it. That and the questions that were raised. How the hell had this guy's cane ended up there? Did someone kill him and toss that up there as some weird trophy? We did our best to find him, but it was almost like a taunt. We still talk about that one from time to time. Missing kids are the most heartbreaking. Doesn't matter what circumstances they go missing under. It's never easy, and we always dread the ones we find deceased. It's not common, but it does happen. David Paulies talks a lot about kids, so our teams find them places they shouldn't be or couldn't be. I can honestly say I've heard about this kind of thing happening more than I've seen it, but I'll share one of the ones that I think about a lot that I witnessed personally. Mother and her 3 kids were out for a picnic in an area of the park that has a small lake. One is 6, one is 5, and the other is about 3. She's watching them all really closely, and according to her, she never lets them out of her sight at any time. She never saw anyone else in the area either, which is important. She packs their stuff up, and they start to head back to the parking area. Now, this lake is only about 2 miles into the woods, and it's on a very clearly established trail. It's almost impossible to get lost getting from the parking area to it, unless you're deliberately going off the path like an imbecile. Her kids are walking in front of her when she hears what sounds like someone coming up the path behind her. She turns around, and in the 4 or so seconds she's not looking, her 5-year-old son vanishes. She figures he stepped off the trail to pee or something, and she asks her other 2 where he went. They both tell her that a big man with a scary face came out of the woods next to them, took the kid's hand and led him into the trees. The 2 remaining kids don't seem upset. In fact, she says later that it seems like they've been drugged, as they're sort of spacey and fuzzy. So of course she freaks out, starts looking frantically in the area for her kid. She's screaming his name, and she says at one point she thinks she heard him answer her. Now, obviously, she can't go blindly running into the woods. She's got the other 2 kids, so she calls the police and they send us out immediately. We respond and we start the search for him. Over the course of this search, which spans miles, we never find a single trace of the kid. Canines can't pick up any scent. We don't find any clothing or broken bushes or literally anything that would signify a child being there. Of course, there's suspicion about the mother for a while, but it's pretty clear that she's completely destroyed by the whole thing. We looked for this kid for weeks with a lot of volunteer help. But eventually, the search peters out and one at Wolfcay move on. Volunteers keep searching though, and one day we get a call on the radio letting us know that a body has been found and needs to be recovered. They tell us the location, and none of us can believe it. We figure it has to be a different kid. But we go out there about 15 miles from the site where he vanished, and sure enough, we find the body of the kid we've been looking for. I have been trying to figure out how this kid got where he did ever since we found him, and I've never come up with an answer. The volunteer just happened to be in the area because he figured he might as well look in places no one else would think to on the off chance the body had been dumped. He comes to the base of a tall, rocky slope, and halfway up, he sees something. He looks through his binoculars, as sure enough is the body of a little boy stuffed in a little opening in the rock. He recognizes the color of the kid's shirt, so he knows right away that it's the missing boy. That's when he calls it in. And we're dispatched. It took us almost an hour to get his body down, and none of us could believe what we were seeing. Not only was this kid 15 miles from where he'd started, there was no possible way he could have gotten up there on his own. This slope is treacherous, and it's hard even for us with our climbing gear. A 5-year-old boy had no way of getting up there, of that I'm certain. Not only that, but the kid doesn't have a scratch on him, and his shoes are gone. But his feet aren't damaged or dirty, so it wasn't as if an animal dragged him up there. And from what we can tell, he hasn't been dead that long. He'd been out there over a month by that point, and it looked like he'd only been dead for, at most, a day or two. The whole thing was unbelievably strange and was one of the most disconcerting calls I've ever been on. We found out later that the coroner determined the kid had died from exposure. He'd frozen to death, probably late at night, 2 days before we found him. There were no suspects and no answers. To date, it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. One of my first jobs as a trainee was a search op for a 4-year-old kid that had gotten separated from his mom. This was one of those cases where we knew we were going to find him because the dogs were on a strong scent trail and we saw clear signs that he was in the area. We ended up finding him in a berry patch about half a mile from where he'd been last seen. Kid wasn't even aware that he'd wandered that far. One of the vets brought him back, which I was glad for because I'm really not good with kids. And I find it hard to talk to them and keep them company. As my trainer and I are headed back, she decides to take me on a detour to show me one of the hot spots where we tend to find missing people. It's a natural dip in the land near a popular trail, and people will usually move downhill because it's easier. We hike out there, it's a few miles away, and we get there in about an hour or so. As we're walking around the area, and she's pointing out places she's found people in the past, I see something in the distance. Now, this area we're in is about 8 miles from the main parking area, though there's back roads you can take to get closer if you don't want to hike that far, but we're on state-protected land, which means there can't be any kind of commercial or residential development out here. The most you'll ever see is a fire tower or makeshift shelter that homeless people think they can get away with building, but I can see from here that whatever this thing is has straight edges. And if there's one thing you learn quickly, it's that nature rarely makes straight lines. I pointed out, but she doesn't say anything. She just hangs back and lets me wander over and check it out. I get within about 20 feet of it, and all the hair on the back of my neck stands up. It's a staircase in the middle of the fucking woods. In the proper context, it would literally be the most benign thing ever. It's just a normal staircase with beige sheet carpet and about 10 steps tall. But instead of being in a house, where it obviously should be, it's out here in the middle of the woods. The sides aren't carpeted, obviously, and I can see the wood it's made of. It's almost like a video game glitch, where the house has failed to load completely and the stairs are the only thing visible. I stand there, and it's like my brain is working overtime to try and make sense of what I'm seeing. My trainer comes and stands next to me, and she just stands there casually, looking at it as if it's the least interesting thing in the world. I ask her what the fuck this thing is doing here, and she just chuckles. Get used to it, rookie. You're gonna see a lot of them. I start to move closer, but she grabs my arm. Hard. I wouldn't do that, she says. Her voice is casual, but her grip is tight, and I just stand there looking at her. You're gonna see them all the time, but don't go near them. Don't touch them, don't go up them. Just ignore them. I start to ask her about it, but something in the way she's looking at me tells me that it's best if I don't. We end up moving on, and the subject doesn't come up again for the rest of my training. She was right, though. I'd say about every 5th call I go on, I end up running across a set of stairs. Sometimes they're relatively close to the path, maybe within 2 or 3 miles. Sometimes they're 20, 30 miles out. Literally in the middle of nowhere, and I only find them during the broadest searches or training weekends. They're usually in good condition, but sometimes it looks like they've been out there for miles. All different kinds, all different sizes. The biggest I ever saw looked like they came out of a turn-of-the-century mansion and were at least 10 feet wide, with steps leading up at least 15 or 20 feet. I've tried talking about it with people, but they just give me the same response my trainer did. It's normal. Don't worry about it. They're not a big deal, but don't go close to them or up them. When trainees ask me about it now, I give them the same response. I don't really know what else to tell them. I'm really hoping someday I get a better answer, but it hasn't happened yet. This is another one that was less spooky and more sad. A young man went missing late in winter when realistically no one should be going that far out onto the trails. We close a lot of them, but some remain open year-round unless there's a shitload of snow. We didn't opt for him, but we had about 6 feet of snow on the ground. It was an unusually heavy snow year, and we knew it wasn't likely that we'd find him until spring when the thaw came. Sure enough, when the first big thaw came, a hiker reported a body a little ways off the main trail. He found him at the base of a tree in a pile of melted snow. I knew right away what had happened, and it scared the living shit out of me. Most of you who ski or snowboard or spend any amount of time on a mountain will probably have guessed too. When snow falls, it doesn't collect as thick in the areas beneath the branches. It happens most with fir trees because they have a sort of closed umbrella shape. So what you end up with is a space around the base of a tree that's filled with a mixture of loose, powdery snow, air, and branches. They're called tree wells, and they're not immediately obvious if you don't know what you're looking for. We put up signs in the Welcome Center, big ones, letting people know how dangerous they are. But every year that we get an unusual amount of snow, at least one person doesn't read them or doesn't take the warning seriously, and we find out about it in spring. My best guess is that this young man was hiking and got tired or maybe a cramp from walking in the deep snow. He went to go sit at the base of the tree, not knowing that there was a tree well, and fell in. He got stuck with his feet up, and the surrounding snow caved in around him. Unable to free himself, he suffocated. It's called snow immersion suffocation, and it doesn't usually happen except in really deep snow. But if you get stuck in a weird position, like this guy did, even 6 feet of snow can be lethal. What scared me the most was imagining how he must have struggled. Upside down in the freezing cold, he didn't die quickly. In the snow would have formed a dense, heavy pile on top of him, and it would have been literally impossible to get out. As it got harder to breathe, he would have known what was happening. I can't even imagine what he was thinking in his last moments. A lot of my less outdoorsy friends want to know if I've ever seen the goatman while I've been out on calls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, I've never had anything quite like that happen. I guess the closest was the whole black-eyed man thing, but I didn't see anything. However, there was one call where I had something kind of similar happen, but I'm not sure I'm willing to chalk it up to the goatman. We gotten a report that an older woman had fainted along one of the trails and needed assistance getting back down to the main area. We hike up to where she's at, and her husband is just beside himself. He runs, well, I guess more jogs to us and tells us that he was a little ways off the trail looking at something when his wife starts screaming behind him. He runs back to her and she's passed out on the trail. We get her on a backboard, and as we're getting her down to the Welcome Center, she comes to and starts screaming again. I calm her down and ask her what happened. I can't remember verbatim what she said, but essentially what happened was she'd been waiting for her husband when she started hearing this really strange sound. She said it sounded sort of like a cat, but it was off somehow and she couldn't quite figure out why. She went a little ahead to try and hear it better, and it sounded like it was coming closer. She said the closer it got, the more uneasy she was until she finally figured out what was wrong. I do remember this next part because it was so weird that I don't think I could forget it if I tried. It wasn't a cat, it was a man saying the word mo over and over, just a meow, 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 hungry, but it wasn't a man. It couldn't have been, because I've never heard a man make his voice buzz like that. I thought my hearing aid was going out, but it wasn't. I adjusted it, and it still sounded all buzzy. It was awful. He was coming closer, but I couldn't see him, and the closer he got, the more scared I was. And the last thing I remember was a shape coming out of the trees. I guess that's when I fainted. Now, obviously, I'm a little perplexed as to why a guy would be out in the fucking woods chanting a meow meow at people. So once we get down the mountain, I tell my superior that I'm gonna go search the area to see if I can find anything. He gives me the go-ahead, and I grab a radio and hike back to where she fainted. I don't see anyone, so I keep going about a mile more. And when I head back, I go off the trail to see if I can figure out where she saw him coming from. It's almost sunset by this point, and I don't have any desire to be out at night alone, so I just sort of write it off and make a mental note to check it out again tomorrow. But as I'm headed back, I start to hear something in the distance, demised vibrations. I stop and I call out for anyone in the immediate area to identify themselves. The sound didn't come closer or get louder, but it sounded exactly like a man saying meow. Meows in this really odd monotone. As comical as it makes it sound, it was almost like that guy in South Park with the electrolyrics, Ned. I go off the trail in the direction I think it's coming from, but I never seem to get closer. It's almost like it's coming from all directions. Eventually, it just sort of fades out, and I ended up going back to the Welcome Center. I didn't get any further reports like that, and even though I went back to that area, I never heard that exact sound again. I suppose it could have been some stupid kid out there fucking with people, but even I have to admit it was weird. I'm not comfortable talking about where exactly I work, unfortunately. In all reality, some of the things I've mentioned here could get me in a lot of trouble or fired, so it's best if I just don't discuss too much. I will say that I'm in the United States, and in an area that is comprised of a great deal of wilderness. We're talking hundreds of miles of thick forest with a mountain range and a few lakes. There is still a great amount of interest in the stairs. And luckily for you guys, my friend has a story that I think you'll all be very interested in. I'll go into that more at the end of this update. As for whether or not I have ever thought of asking my superiors about them, I have, but again, I don't want to risk my job. However, one of my former superiors no longer works as an NCR officer, and it's possible that he may be willing to talk to me about it. Substitutions. I'll be speaking to him later in the week, and I will let you all know what comes of that. As far as advice on becoming an NCR officer goes, I think the best advice I can give is to contact your local Forest Service office and see if they offer training courses or what the qualifications are. I've been doing this for years, and I started out as a volunteer helping on SAR operations. It's a great job despite the occasional tragic situations, and I wouldn't want to do anything else. All right, let's move on to the stories. The first happened on a case that I went out on right after I got out of training and was still pretty new to everything. Before I took this job, I was a volunteer, so I had a basic idea of what to expect. But on those calls, you're mostly dealing with finding lost people after vets have found signs of them. As a NASAR officer, you go out for all kinds of cases, from animal bites to heart attacks. This case got called in early in the morning from a young couple who were up on one of the trails that goes by the lake. The husband was completely hysterical, and we couldn't really figure out what was going on. He could hear the woman screaming in the background, and he was begging us to come up there right away. When we get there, we see him holding his wife, and she's got something in her arms. She's screaming these awful, almost animal-like screams, and he's sobbing. He sees us, and he screams at us to help them, to please get an ambulance up there. Now, obviously, we can't just drive an ambulance up the walking path, so we ask him if his wife needs help, or if she can walk on her own. He's still hysterical, but he manages to tell us that it's not his wife that needs help. I go over while one of the vets tries to calm him down, and I ask the wife what's going on. She's rocking, holding something, and just shrieking over and over. I crouch down and see that whatever she's holding, it's covering her with blood. That's when I notice the sling on her front and my heart sinks. I ask her to tell me what's going on, and I sort of pry her arms gently open so I can see what she's holding. It's her baby, obviously dead. His head is caved in on one side, and he's covered in scratches. Now, I've seen dead bodies before, but something about this whole situation hits me hard. I have to take a second to compose myself, and I get up and go get one of the other vets who's standing by. I tell him that it's a dead kid, and he sort of pats my shoulder and tells me he'll deal with it. It took us over an hour to get this woman to let us see her kid. Every time we try to take him from her, she flips out and tells us we can't have him, that he'll be okay if we just leave her alone and let her help him. But eventually, one of the vets manages to calm her down, and she gives us the body. We took it back to the med area, but when the EMPs showed up, they told us that there was never any hope of saving the kid. He died instantly from the trauma to his head. I was good buddies with one of the nurses who met them at the hospital, and she told me later what had happened. Turns out the couple had been walking with the baby in the sling, and they stopped because the kid was fussing. Dad takes the kid and is holding him, looking out over this little gully by the path. The mom comes to stand next to him, but she ends up stepping on a loose patch of soil as she trips. She falls into the dad, who drops the kid, who ends up falling about 20 feet down this little gully onto the rocks at the bottom. The dad climbed down and recovered the kid, but he'd fallen right on his head and was dead by the time he got there. The baby was only about 15 months old. It was a total freak accident, a series of events that coalesced into the worst possible outcome, probably one of the more awful calls I've been on. I haven't seen a lot of animal bites in my time as NSAR officer, mostly because there aren't that many animals that come around the area. While there are bears in the area, they tend to stay pretty far away from people, and sightings are highly unusual. Most of the animals you'll see are small ones like coyotes, raccoons, or skunks. What we do see frequently, though, are moose. And let me tell you, moose are nasty fuckers. They'll chase after anything for any reason. And God help you if you get in between a female and its baby. One of the more amusing calls was of a guy who'd gotten chased down by an absolutely massive male moose and was stuck up a tree. Took us almost an hour to get him down. And when he was finally on solid ground again, he looks at me and says, "God damn, them fuckers is big up close." I guess that's not really a scary story, but we still laugh about that one. I honestly don't know how I'd forgotten this story, but it is by far The scariest thing that's happened to me, I guess maybe I've tried so long to forget about it that it just didn't come to mind right away. As someone who spends literally all of their time in the woods, you don't ever want to let yourself get scared of being alone or out in the middle of nowhere. That's why when you have experiences like this, you tend to just forget about them and move on. This is, to date, the only thing that's ever made me really seriously consider if this job is the right one for me. I don't really like talking about it much, but I'll do the best I can to remember it all. As I recall, this took place right at the end of spring. It was a typical lost child call. A 4-year-old girl had wandered away from her family's campsite and had been missing for about 2 hours. Her parents were completely despondent and told us what most parents do. My kid would never wander away. She's so good about staying close.